man's blood." He made a sound of disgust in his throat. "We just ran like chickens with a fox in the hen yard till Master Lan put some backbone into us." "No need to be so hard," Tom said. "You did as well as anyone could. Not every Trolloc lying out there fell to the two of them." Yes, well," Master Alvear gave himself a shake. "It's still almost too much to believe. An Aes Sedai in Emond's Field, and Master Lan is a warder." "An Aes Sedai?" Rand whispered. "She can't be. I talked to her. She isn't. She doesn't." "Did you think they wore signs?" the mayor said wryly. "Aes Sedai painted across their backs, and maybe, 'Danger, stay away'?" Suddenly he slapped his forehead. "Aes Sedai! I'm an old fool and losing my wits. There's a chance, Rand, if you're willing to take it. I can't tell you to do it, and I don't know if I'd have the nerve if it were me." "A chance?" Rand said. "I'll take any chance if it'll help." "Aes Sedai can heal, Rand. Burn me, lad, you've heard the stories. They can cure where medicines fail. Gleeman, you should have remembered that better than I. Gleeman's tales are full of Aes Sedai. Why didn't you speak up instead of letting me flail around?" "I'm a stranger here," Tom said, looking longingly at his unlit pipe. "And Goodman Copland isn't the only one who wants nothing to do with Aes Sedai. Best the idea came from you." "An Aes Sedai," Rand muttered, trying to make the woman who had smiled at him fit the stories. Help from an Aes Sedai was sometimes worse than no help at all, so the stories said, like poison in a pie, and their gifts always had a hook in them, like fish bait. Suddenly the coin in his pocket, the coin Moraine had given him, seemed like a burning coal. It was all he could do not to rip it out of his coat and throw it out the window. "Nobody wants to get involved with Aes Sedai, lad," the mayor said slowly. "It is the only chance I can see, but it's still no small decision. I cannot make it for you, but I have seen nothing but good from Mistress Moraine. Moraine Sedai, I should call her, I suppose. Sometimes," he gave a meaningful look at Tam, "you have to take a chance, even if it's a poor one." "Some of the stories are exaggerated in a way," Tom added, as if the words were being dragged from him. "Some of them. Besides, boy, what choice do you have?" "None," Rand sighed. Tam still had not moved a muscle. His eyes were sunken as if he had been sick a week. I'll go find her." "The other side of the bridges," the Gleeman said, "where they are disposing of the dead Trollocs. But be careful, boy. Aes Sedai do what they do for reasons of their own, and they aren't always the reasons others think." The last was a shout that followed Rand through the door. He had to hold on to the sword hilt to keep the scabbard from tangling in his legs as he ran, but he would not take the time to remove it. He clattered down the stairs and dashed out of the inn, tiredness forgotten for the moment. A chance for Tam, however small, was enough to overcome a night without sleep, for a time at least. That the chance came from an Aes Sedai, or what the price of it might be, he did not want to consider. And as for actually facing an Aes Sedai, he took a deep breath and tried to move faster. The bonfire stood well beyond the last houses to the north on the west side of the road to Watch Hill. The wind still carried the oily black columns of smoke away from the village, but even so, a sickly sweet stink filled the air, like a roast left hours too long on the spit. Rand gagged at the smell, then swallowed hard when he realized its source. A fine thing to do with Beltane fires. The men tending the fires had cloths tied over their noses and mouths, but their grimaces made it plain the vinegar dampening the cloths was not enough. Even if it did kill the stench, they still knew the stench was there, and they still knew what they were doing. Two of the men were untying the harness straps of one of the big Durans from a Trolloc's ankles. Lan, squatting beside the body, had tossed back the blanket enough to reveal the Trolloc's shoulders and goat-snouted head. As Rand trotted up, the warder unfastened a metal badge, a blood-red enameled trident, from one spiked shoulder of the Trolloc's shirt of black mail. "Kobol," he announced. He bounced the badge on his palm and snatched it out of the air with a growl. "That makes 7 bands so far." Moraine, seated cross-legged on the ground a short distance off, shook her head tiredly. A walking staff covered from end to end in carved vines and flowers lay across her knees, and her dress had the rumpled look of having been worn too long. 7 bands. 7. That many have not acted together since the Trolloc Wars. Bad news piles on bad news. I'm afraid, Lan. I thought we had gained a march, but we may be further behind than ever. Rand stared at her, unable to speak. An Aes Sedai. He had been trying to convince himself that she would not look any different now that he knew what he was looking at, and to his surprise, she did not. She was no longer quite so pristine, not with wisps of her hair sticking out in all directions, and a faint streak of soot across her nose, yet not really different either. Surely there must be something about an Aes Sedai to mark her for what she was. On the other hand, if outward appearance reflected what was inside, and if the stories were true, then she should look closer to a Trolloc than to a more than handsome woman whose dignity was not dented by sitting in the dirt. And she could help Tam. Whatever the cost, there was that before anything else. He took a deep breath. Mistress Moraine. Moraine Sedai. Both turned to look at him, and he froze under her gaze. Not the calm, smiling gaze he remembered from the green. Her face was tired, but her dark eyes were a hawk's eyes. Aes Sedai, breakers of the world, puppeteers who pulled strings and made thrones and nations dance in designs only the women from Tar Valon knew. A little more light in the darkness, the Aes Sedai murmured. She raised her voice. How are your dreams, Rand al'Thor? He stared at her. My dreams? A night like that can give a man bad dreams, Rand. If you have nightmares, you must tell me of it. I can help with bad dreams, sometimes. There's nothing wrong with my... It's my father. He's hurt. It's not much more than a scratch, but the fever is burning him up. The wisdom won't help. She says she can't. But the stories... She raised an eyebrow, and he stopped and swallowed hard. Light. Is there a story with an Aes Sedai where she isn't a villain? He looked at the warder, but Lan appeared more interested in the dead Trolloc than in anything Rand might say. Fumbling his way under her eyes, he went on. It said Aes Sedai can heal. If you can help him. Anything you can do for him. Whatever the cost. He took a deep breath and finished up in a rush. I'll pay any price in my power if you help him. Anything. Any price, Moraine mused, half to herself. We will speak of prices later, Rand, if at all. I can make no promises. Your wisdom knows what she is about. I will do what I can, but it is beyond my power to stop the wheel from turning. Death comes sooner or later to everyone, the warder said grimly. Unless they serve the Dark One, and only fools are willing to pay that price. Moraine made a clucking sound. Do not be so gloomy, Lan. We have some reason to celebrate. A small one, but a reason. She used the staff to pull herself to her feet. Take me to your father, Rand. I will help him as much as I am able. Too many here have refused to let me help at all. They have heard the stories, too, she added dryly. He's at the inn, Rand said. This way. And thank you. Thank you. They followed, but his pace took him quickly ahead. He slowed impatiently for them to catch up, then darted ahead again and had to wait again. Please hurry, he urged, so caught up in actually getting help for Tam that he never considered the temerity of prodding an Aes Sedai. The fever is burning him up. Lan glared at him. Can't you see she's tired? Even with an Angreal, what she did last night was like running around the village with a sack of stones on her back. I don't know that you are worth it, sheepherder, no matter what she says. Rand blinked and held his tongue. Gently, my friend, Moraine said. Without slowing her pace, she reached up to pat the warder's shoulder. He towered over her protectively, as if he could give her strength just by being close. You think only of taking care of me. Why should he not think the same of his father? Lan scowled, but fell silent. I am coming as quickly as I can, Rand, I promise you. The fierceness of her eyes, or the calm of her voice, not gentle exactly, more firmly in command, Rand did not know which to believe. Or perhaps they did go together. Aes Sedai. He was committed now. He matched his stride to theirs, and tried not to think of what the price might be that they would talk about later. Chapter 8. A Place of Safety. While he was still coming through the door, Rand's eyes went to his father. His father, no matter what anyone said. Tam had not moved an inch. His eyes were still shut, and his breath came in labored gasps, low and rasping. The white-haired gleeman cut off a conversation with the mayor, who was bent over the bed again, tending Tam, and gave Moraine an uneasy look. The Aes Sedai ignored him. Indeed, she ignored everyone except for Tam. But at him, she stared with an intent frown. Tom stuck his unlit pipe between his teeth, then snatched it out again and glowered at it. "Man cannot even smoke in peace," he muttered. "I'd better make sure some farmer doesn't steal my cloak to keep his cow warm. At least I can have my pipe out there." He hurried out of the room. Lan stared after him, his angular face as expressionless as a rock. "I do not like that man. There is something about him I don't trust. I did not see a hair of him last night." "He was there," Bran said, watching Moraine uncertainly. "He must have been. His cloak did not get singed in front of the fireplace." Bran did not care if the gleeman had spent the night hiding in the stable. "My father," he said to Moraine, pleadingly. Bran opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Moraine said, "Leave me with him, Master Alvear. There is nothing you can do here now, except get in my way." For a minute, Bran hesitated, torn between dislike of being ordered about in his own inn and reluctance to disobey an Aes Sedai. Finally, he straightened up to clap Rand on the shoulder. "Come along, boy. Let us leave Moraine Sedai to her... There's plenty you can give me a hand with downstairs. Before you know it, Tam will be shouting for his pipe and a mug of ale." "Can I stay?" Bran spoke to Moraine, though she did not really seem to be aware of anyone besides Tam. Bran's hand tightened, but Rand ignored him. "Please, I'll keep out of your way. You won't even know I am here. He's my father," he added with a fierceness that startled him and widened the mayor's eyes in surprise. Rand hoped the others put it down to tiredness or the strain of dealing with an Aes Sedai. Yes, Moraine said impatiently. She had tossed her cloak and staff carelessly across the only chair in the room, and now she pushed up the sleeves of her gown, baring her arms to her elbows. Her attention never really left Tam, even while she spoke. "Sit over there. And you too, Lan." She gestured vaguely in the direction of a long bench against the wall. Her eyes traveled slowly from Tam's feet to his head, but Rand had the prickly feeling that she was looking beyond him in some fashion. "You may talk if you wish," she went on absently, "but do it quietly. Now you go, Master Alvear. This is a sick room, not a gathering hall. See that I am not disturbed." The mayor grumbled under his breath, though not loudly enough to catch her attention, of course, squeezed Rand's shoulder again, then obediently, if reluctantly, closed the door behind him. Muttering to herself, the Aes Sedai knelt beside the bed and rested her hands lightly on Tam's chest. She closed her eyes, and for a long time she neither moved nor made a sound. In the stories, Aes Sedai wonders were always accompanied by flashes and thunderclaps or other signs to indicate mighty works and great powers. The power, the one power, drawn from the true source that drove the Wheel of Time. That was not something Rand wanted to think about. The power involved with Tam, himself in the same room where the power might be used. In the same village was bad enough. For all he could tell, though, Moraine might just as well have gone to sleep. But he thought Tam's breathing sounded easier. She must be doing something. So intent was he that he jumped when Lan spoke softly. "That is a fine weapon you wear. Is there by chance a heron on the blade as well?" For a moment, Rand stared at the warder, not grasping what it was he was talking about. He had completely forgotten Tam's sword in the lather of dealing with an Aes Sedai. It did not seem so heavy anymore. "Yes, there is. What is she doing?" "I'd not have thought to find a heron-marked sword in a place like this," Lan said. "It belongs to my father." He glanced at Lan's sword, the hilt just visible at the edge of his cloak. The two swords did look a good deal alike, except that no herons showed on the warder's. He swung his eyes back to the bed. Tam's breathing did sound easier. The rasp was gone. He was sure of it. He bought it a long time ago. Strange thing for a sheepherder to buy. Rand spared a sidelong look for Lan. For a stranger to wonder about the sword was prying. For a warder to do it... Still, he felt he had to say something. He never had any use for it that I know of. He said it had no use. Until last night, anyway. I didn't even know he had it till then. He called it useless, did he? He must not always have thought so. Lan touched the scabbard at Rand's waist briefly with one finger. There are places where the heron is a symbol of the master swordsman. That blade must have traveled a strange road to end up with a sheepherder in the Two Rivers. Rand ignored the unspoken question. Moraine still had not moved. Was the Aes Sedai doing anything? He shivered and rubbed his arms, not sure he really wanted to know what she was doing. An Aes Sedai. A question of his own popped into his head then, one he did not want to ask, one he needed an answer to. The mayor. He cleared his throat and took a deep breath. The mayor said the only reason there's anything left of the village is because of you and her. He made himself look at the warder. If you had been told about a man in the woods, a man who made people afraid just by looking at them, would that have warned you? A man whose horse doesn't make any noise, and the wind doesn't touch his cloak? Would you have known what was going to happen? Could you and Moraine Sedai have stopped it if you'd known about him? Not without half a dozen of my sisters, Moraine said, and Rand started. She still knelt by the bed, but she had taken her hands from Tam and half turned to face the two of them on the bench. Her voice never raised, but her eyes pinned Rand to the wall. Had I known when I left Tar Valon that I would find Trollocs and Myrddraal here, I would have brought half a dozen of them. A dozen, if I had to drag them by the scruffs of their necks. By myself, a month's warning would have made little difference. Perhaps none. There is only so much one person can do, even calling on the One Power. And there were probably well over 100 Trollocs scattered around this district last night. An entire fist. It would still have been good to know, Lance said sharply, the sharpness directed at Rand. When did you see him, exactly? And where? That's of no consequence now, Moraine said. I will not have the boy thinking he is to blame for something when he is not. I am as much to blame. That accursed raven yesterday, the way it behaved, should have warned me. And you too, my old friend. Her tongue clicked angrily. I was overconfident to the point of arrogance, sure that the Dark One's touch would not have spread so far. Nor so heavily. Not yet. So sure. Rand blinked. The raven? I don't understand. Carrion eaters. Land's mouth twisted in distaste. The Dark One's minions often find spies among creatures that feed on death. Ravens and crows, mainly. Rats in the cities, sometimes. A quick shiver ran through Rand. Ravens and crows as spies of the Dark One? There were ravens and crows everywhere now. The Dark One's touch, Moraine had said. The Dark One was always there, he knew that. But if you tried to walk in the light, tried to live a good life, and did not name him, he could not harm you. That was what everybody believed, what everybody learned with his mother's milk. But Moraine seemed to be saying... His glance fell on Tam, and everything else was pushed right out of his head. His father's face was noticeably less flushed than it had been, and his breathing sounded almost normal. Rand would have leaped up if Lan had not caught his arm. You've done it! Moraine shook her head and sighed. Not yet. I hope it is only not yet. Trolloc weapons are made at forges in the valley called Thankandar, on the very slopes of Sheol Ghul itself. Some of them take a taint from that place, a stain of evil in the metal. Those tainted blades make wounds that will not heal unaided, or cause deadly fevers, strange sicknesses that medicines cannot touch. I have soothed your father's pain, but the mark, the taint, is still in him. Left alone, it will grow again and consume him. But you won't leave it alone. Rand's words were half plea, half command. He was shocked to realize he had spoken to an Aes Sedai like that, but she seemed not to notice his tone. I will not, she agreed simply. I am very tired, Rand, and I have had no chance to rest since last night. Ordinarily, it would not matter, but for this kind of hurt... This, she took a small bundle of white silk from her pouch, is an Angreal. She saw his expression. You know of Angreal, then? Good. Unconsciously, he leaned back, further away from her and what she held. A few stories mentioned Angreal, those relics of the age of legends that Aes Sedai used to perform their greatest wonders. He was startled to see her unwrap a smooth, ivory figurine, age-darkened to deep brown. No longer than her hand, it was a woman in flowing robes, with long hair falling about her shoulders. We have lost the making of these, she said. So much is lost. perhaps never to be found again. So few remain. The Amerlin seat almost did not allow me to take this one. It is well for Emmons Field and for your father that she did give her permission. But you must not hope too much. Now, even with it, I can do little more than I could have without it yesterday. And the taint is strong. It has had time to fester.
You can help him, Rand said fervently. I know you can.
Moraine smiled, a bare curving of her lips. We shall see. Then she turned back to Tam. One hand she laid on his forehead. The other cupped the ivory figure. Eyes closed, her face took on a look of concentration. She scarcely seemed to breathe. That rider you spoke of, Lance said quietly. The one who made you afraid. That was surely a Myrddraal.
A Myrddraal? Rand exclaimed. But Fade's at 20 feet tall and...
The words faded away under the warder's mirthless grin. Sometimes, sheepherder, stories make things larger than truth. Believe me, the truth is big enough with a half-man. Half-man, Lurk, Fade, Shadow Man. The name depends on the land you're in, but they all mean Myrddraal. Fades are Trollocs' spawn. Throwbacks almost to the human stock the Dreadlords used to make the Trollocs. Almost. But if the human strain is made stronger, so is the taint that twists the Trollocs. Half-men have powers of a kind, the sort that stem from the Dark One. Only the weakest Aes Sedai would fail to be a match for a Fade, 1 against 1. But many a good man and true has fallen to them. Since the wars that ended the Age of Legends, since the Forsaken were bound, they have been the brain that tells the Trolloc fists where to strike. In the days of the Trolloc Wars, half-men led the Trollocs in battle, under the Dreadlords.
He scared me, Rand said faintly. He just looked at me and...
He shivered. No need for shame, sheepherder. They scare me, too. I've seen men who have been soldiers all their lives freeze like a bird facing a snake when they confronted a half-man. In the north, in the borderlands along the Great Blight, there is a saying. The look of the eyeless is fear.
The eyeless?
Rand said, and Lan nodded. Myrddraal see like eagles in darkness or in light, but they have no eyes. I can think of few things more dangerous than facing a Myrddraal. Moraine Sedai and I both tried to kill the one that was here last night, and we failed every time. Half-men have the Dark One's own luck.
Rand swallowed. The Trolloc said the Myrddraal wanted to talk to me. I didn't know what it meant.
Lan's head jerked up. His eyes were blue stones. You talked to a Trolloc?
Not exactly, Rand stammered.
The warder's gaze held him like a trap.
It talked to me. It said it wouldn't hurt me, that the Myrddraal wanted to talk to me. Then it tried to kill me.
He licked his lips and rubbed his hand along the knobby leather of the sword hilt. In short, choppy sentences, he explained about returning to the farmhouse.
I killed it instead, he finished. By accident, really. It jumped at me, and I had the sword in my hand.
Lan's face softened slightly, if rock could be said to soften. Even so, that is something to speak of, sheepherder. Until last night, there were few men south of the borderlands who could say they had seen a Trolloc, much less killed one.
And fewer still who have slain a Trolloc alone and unaided, Moraine said wearily. It is done, Rand. Lan, help me up.
The warder sprang to her side, but he was no quicker than Rand darting to the bed. Tam's skin was cool to the touch, though his face had a pale, washed-out look, as if he had spent far too long out of the sun. His eyes were still closed, but he drew the deep breaths of normal sleep.
He will be all right now?
Rand asked anxiously.
With rest, yes, Moraine said. A few weeks in bed, and he will be as good as ever.
She walked unsteadily, despite holding Lan's arm. He swept her cloak and staff from the chair cushion for her to sit, and she eased herself down with a sigh. With a slow care, she rewrapped the angreal and returned it to her pouch. Rand's shoulders shook. He bit his lip to keep from laughing. At the same time, he had to scrub a hand across his eyes to clear away tears.
Thank you.
In the Age of Legends, Moraine went on, some Aes Sedai could fan life and health to flame if only the smallest spark remained. Those days are gone, though, perhaps forever.
So much was lost. Not just the making of Angreal. So much that could be done which we dare not even dream of, if we remember it at all. There are far fewer of us now. Some talents are all but gone, and many that remain seem weaker. Now there must be both will and strength for the body to draw on, and even the strongest of us can do nothing in the way of healing. It is fortunate that your father is a strong man, both in body and spirit. As it is, he used up much of his strength in the fight for life. But all that is left now is for him to recuperate. That will take time, but the taint is gone. I can never repay you, he told her without taking his eyes from Tam. But anything I can do for you, I will. Anything at all. He remembered the talk of prices then, and his promise. Kneeling beside Tam, he meant it even more than before, but it still was not easy to look at her. Anything. As long as it does not hurt the village or my friends. Moraine raised a hand dismissively. If you think it is necessary, I would like to talk with you anyway. You will no doubt leave at the same time we do, and we can speak at length then. Leave? He exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. Is it really that bad? Everyone looked to me as if they were ready to start rebuilding. We are pretty settled folk in the Two Rivers. Nobody ever leaves. Rand. And where would we go? Padan Thane said the weather is just as bad everywhere else. He was the peddler. The Trollocs. Rand swallowed, wishing Tom Merrilin had not told him what Trollocs ate. The best I can see to do is stay right here where we belong, in the Two Rivers, and put things back together. We have crops in the ground, and it has to warm enough for the shearing soon. I don't know who started this talk about leaving. One of the Coplans, I'll bet. But whoever it was... Sheepherder, Lan broke in. You talk when you should be listening. He blinked at both of them. He had been half babbling, he realized, and he had rambled on while she tried to talk. While an Aes Sedai tried to talk. He wondered what to say, how to apologize, but Moraine smiled while he was still thinking. I understand how you feel, Rand, she said, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she really did. Think no more of it. Her mouth tightened, and she shook her head. I have handled this badly, I see. I should have rested first, I suppose. It is you who will be leaving, Rand. You who must leave for the sake of your village. Me? He cleared his throat and tried again. Me? It sounded a little better this time. Why do I have to go? I don't understand any of this. I don't want to go anywhere. Moraine looked at Lan, and the warder unfolded his arms. He looked at Rand from under his leather headband, and Rand had the feeling of being weighed on invisible scales again. Did you know, Lan said suddenly, that some homes were not attacked? Half the village is in ashes, he protested, but the warder waved it away. Some houses were only torched to create confusion. The Trollocs ignored them afterwards, and the people who fled from them as well, unless they actually got in the way of the true attack. Most of the people who've come in from the outlying farms never saw a hair of a Trolloc, and that only at a distance. Most never knew there was any trouble until they saw the village. I did hear about Darl Coplan, Rand said slowly. I suppose it just didn't sink in. 2 farms were attacked, Lan went on. Yours and one other. Because of Beltane, everyone who lived at the second farm was already in the village. Many people were saved because the Myrddraal was ignorant of Two Rivers customs. Festival and Winter Night made its task all but impossible, but it did not know that. Rand looked at Moraine, leaning back in the chair. But she said nothing, only watched him, a finger laid across her lips. Our farm and who else's? He asked finally. The Aybara farm, Lan replied. Here in Emmonsfield, they struck first at the forge and the blacksmith's house, and Master Cawthon's house. Rand's mouth was suddenly dry. That's crazy, he managed to get out, then jumped as Moraine straightened. Not crazy, Rand, she said. Purposeful. The Trollocs did not come to Emmonsfield by happenstance, and they did not do what they did for the pleasure of killing and burning, however much that delighted them. They knew what, or rather who, they were after. The Trollocs came to kill or capture young men of a certain age who lived near Emmonsfield. My age? Rand's voice shook, and he did not care. Right. Matt? What about Perrin? Alive and well, Moraine assured him, if a trifle sooty. Van Craw and them Thane?
We're never in any danger, Lan said. At least, no more than anyone else.
But they saw the rider, the Fade, too, and they're the same age as I am. Master Craw's house was not even damaged, Moraine said, and the miller and his family slept through half the attack before the noise woke them. Van is 10 months older than you, and Lem 8 months younger. She smiled dryly at his surprise. I told you I asked questions, and I also said young men of a certain age. You and your 2 friends are within weeks of one another. It was you 3 the Myrddraal sought, and none others. Rand shifted uneasily, wishing she would not look at him like that, as if her eyes could pierce his brain and read what lay in every corner of it. What would they want with us? We're just farmers, shepherds. That is a question that has no answer in the 2 rivers, Moraine said quietly. But the answer is important. Trollocs, where they have not been seen in almost 2,000 years, tells us that much. Lots of stories tell about Trolloc raids, Rand said stubbornly. We just never had one here before. Warders fight Trollocs all the time. Lan snorted.
Boy, I expect to fight Trollocs along the Great Blight, but not here. Nearly 600 leagues to the south. That was as hot a raid last night as I'd expect to see in Shinar, or any of the borderlands.
In one of you, Moraine said. Or all 3. There is something the Dark One fears. That's impossible.
Rand stumbled to the window and stared out at the village, at the people working among the ruins.
I don't care what's happened. That is just impossible.
Something on the green caught his eye. He stared, then realized it was the blackened stump of the spring pole. A fine Beltane with a peddler and a gleeman, and not strangers. He shivered and shook his head violently.
No, I'm a shepherd. The Dark One can't be interested in me.
It took a great deal of effort, Lan said grimly, to bring so many Trollocs so far without raising a hue and cry from the borderlands to Caemlyn and beyond. I wish I knew how they did it. Do you really believe they went to all that bother just to burn a few houses?
They will be back, Moraine added.
Rand had his mouth open to argue with Lan, but that brought him up short. He spun to face her.
Back? Can't you stop them? You did last night and you were surprised then. Now you know they are here.
Perhaps, Moraine replied.
I could send to Tar Valon for some of my sisters. They might have time to make the journey before we need them. The Myrddraal knows I am here too, and it probably will not attack, not openly at least, lacking reinforcements. More Myrddraal and more Trollocs. With enough Aes Sedai and enough warders, the Trollocs can be beaten off, though I cannot say how many battles it will take. A vision danced in his head of Emond's Field all in ashes, all the farms burned, and Watch Hill and Devon Ride and Tarren Ferry. All ashes and blood. No, he said, and felt a wrenching inside, as if he had lost his grip on something. That's why I have to leave, isn't it? The Trollocs won't come back if I am not here. The last trace of obstinacy made him add, if they really are after me. Moraine's eyebrows raised as if she were surprised that he was not convinced, but Lan said, Are you willing to bet your village on it, sheepherder? Your whole 2 rivers? Rand's stubbornness faded. No, he said again. He felt that emptiness inside again, too. Perrin and Matt have to go too, don't they? Leaving the 2 rivers. Leaving his home and his father. At least Tam would get better. At least he would be able to hear him say all that on the quarry road had been nonsense. We could go to Baerlon, I suppose. Or even Caemlyn. I've heard there are more people in Caemlyn than in the whole 2 rivers. We'd be safe there. He tried out a laugh that sounded hollow. I used to daydream about seeing Caemlyn. I never thought it would come about like this. There was a long silence, then Lan said, I would not count on Caemlyn for safety. If the Myrddraal want you badly enough, they will find a way. Walls are a poor bar to a half-man, and you would be a fool not to believe they want you very badly indeed. Rand thought his spirits had sunk as low as they possibly could, but at that, they slid deeper. There is a place of safety, Moraine said softly, and Rand's ears pricked up to listen. In Tar Valon, you would be among Aes Sedai and warders. Even during the Trolloc Wars, the forces of the Dark One feared to attack the Shining Walls. The one attempt was their greatest defeat until the very end. And Tar Valon holds all the knowledge we Aes Sedai have gathered since the time of madness. Some fragments even date from the Age of Legends. In Tar Valon, if anywhere, you will be able to learn why the Myrddraal want you. Why the Father of Lies wants you. That I can promise. A journey all the way to Tar Valon was almost beyond thinking. A journey to a place where he would be surrounded by Aes Sedai. Of course, Moraine had healed Tam, or it looked as if she had at least, but there were all those stories. It was uncomfortable enough to be in a room with one Aes Sedai, but to be in a city full of them? And she still had not demanded her price. There was always a price, so the stories said. How long will my father sleep? He asked at last. I have to tell him. He shouldn't just wake and find me gone. He thought he heard Lan give a sigh of relief. He looked at the water curiously, but Lan's face was as expressionless as ever. It is unlikely he will wake before we depart, Moraine said. I mean to go soon after full dark. Even a single day of delay could be fatal. It will be best if you leave him a note. In the night? Rand said doubtfully, and Lan nodded. The Halfmen will discover we are gone soon enough. There is no need to make things any easier for it than we must. Rand fussed with his father's blankets. It was a very long way to Tar Valon. In that case, I'd better go find Mat and Perrin. I will attend to that. Moraine got to her feet briskly and donned her cloak with suddenly restored vigor. She put a hand on his shoulder, and he tried very hard not to flinch. She did not press hard, but it was an iron grip that held him as surely as a forked stick held a snake. It will be best if we keep all of this just among us. You understand? The same ones who put the dragon's fang on the inn door might make trouble if they knew. I understand. He drew a relieved breath when she took her hand away. I will have Mr. Salvere bring you something to eat, she went on, just as if she had not noticed his reaction. Then you need to sleep. It will be a hard journey tonight, even if you are rested. The door closed behind them, and Rand stood looking down at Tam. Looking at Tam, but seeing nothing. Not until that very minute had he realized that Emond's Field was a part of him as much as he was a part of it. He realized it now because he knew that was what he had felt tearing loose. He was apart from the village now. The Shepherd of the Night wanted him. It was impossible. He was only a farmer, but the Trollocs had come, and Lan was right about one thing. He could not risk the village on the chance Moraine was wrong. He could not even tell anyone. The Coplans really would make trouble about something like that. He had to trust in Aes Sedai. Don't wake him now, Mr. Salvere said, as the mayor shut the door behind his wife and himself. The cloth-covered tray she carried gave off delicious, warm smells. She set it on the chest against the wall, then firmly moved Rand away from the bed. Mistress Moraine told me what he needs, she said softly. And it does not include you falling on top of him from exhaustion. I've brought you a bite to eat. Don't let it get cold now.
I wish you wouldn't call her that, Rand said peevishly. Moraine Sedai is proper. She might get mad.
Mistress Alvere gave him a pat on the cheek. You just leave me to worry about that. She and I had a long talk. And keep your voice down. If you wake Tam, you'll have to answer to me and Moraine Sedai. She put an emphasis on Moraine's title that made Bran's insistence seem foolish. The two of you keep out of my way. With a fond smile for her husband, she turned to the bed and Tam. Master Alvere gave Rand a frustrated look. She's an Aes Sedai. Half the women in the village act as if she sits in the women's circle, and the rest as if she were a Trolloc. Not a one of them seems to realize you have to be careful around Aes Sedai. The men may keep looking at her sideways, but at least they aren't doing anything that might provoke her. Careful, Rand thought. It was not too late to start being careful. Master Alvere, he said slowly, do you know how many farms were attacked?
Only 2 that I've heard of so far, including your place.
The mayor paused, frowning, then shrugged.
It doesn't seem enough with what happened here. I should be glad of it, but... well, we'll probably hear of more before the day is out.
Rand sighed. No need to ask which farms. Here in the village, was there anything to show what they were after?
After, boy? I don't know that they were after anything, except maybe killing us all. It was just the way I said. The dogs barking, and Moraine Sedai and Lan running through the streets. Then somebody shouted that Master Luhan's house and the forge were on fire. Abul Cawthan's house flared up. Odd that, it's nearly in the middle of the village. Anyway, the next thing the Trollocs were all among us. No, I don't think they were after anything.
He gave an abrupt bark of a laugh and cut it short with a wary look at his wife. She did not look around from Tam.
To tell the truth,
he went on more quietly,
they seemed almost as confused as we were. I doubt they expected to find an Aes Sedai here, or a warder.
I suppose not, Rand said, grimacing. If Moraine had told the truth about that, she probably had told the truth about the rest, too. For a moment, he thought about asking the mayor's advice, but Master Alvir obviously knew little more about Aes Sedai than anyone else in the village. Besides, he was reluctant to tell even the mayor what was going on, what Moraine said was going on. He was not sure if he was more afraid of being laughed at or being believed. He rubbed a thumb against the hilt of Tam's sword. His father had been out into the world. He must know more about Aes Sedai than the mayor did. But if Tam really had been out of the Two Rivers, then maybe what he had said in the Westwood. He scrubbed both his hands through his hair, scattering that line of thought.
You need sleep, lad, the mayor said.
Yes, you do, Mistress Alvir added. You're almost falling down where you stand. Rand blinked at her in surprise. He had not even realized she had left his father. He did need sleep. Just the thought set off a yawn.
You can take the bed in the next room, the mayor said. There's already a fire laid.
Rand looked at his father. Tam was still deep in sleep, and that made him yawn again. I'd rather stay in here if you don't mind, for when he wakes up. Sick-room matters were in Mistress Alvir's province, and the mayor left it to her. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. But you let him wake on his own. If you bother his sleep. He tried to say he would do as she ordered, but the words got tangled in yet another yawn. She shook her head with a smile. You will be asleep yourself in no time at all. If you must stay, curl up next to the fire, and drink a little of that beef broth before you doze off. I will, Rand said. He would have agreed to anything that kept him in that room. And I won't wake him. See that you do not, Mistress Alvir told him firmly, but not in an unkindly way. I'll bring you up a pillow and some blankets. When the door finally closed behind them, Rand dragged the lone chair in the room over beside the bed and sat down where he could watch Tam. It was all very well for Mistress Alvir to talk about sleep. His jaws cracked as he stifled a yawn. But he could not sleep yet. Tam might wake at any time, and maybe only stay awake a short while. Rand had to be waiting when he did. He grimaced and twisted in the chair, absently shifting the sword hilt out of his ribs. He still felt awkward about telling anyone what Moraine had said. But this was Tam, after all. This was... Without realizing it, he set his jaw determinedly. My father. I can tell my father anything. He twisted a little more in the chair and put his head against the chair back. Tam was his father, and nobody could tell him what to say or not say to his father. He just had to stay awake until Tam woke up. He just had to... Chapter 9. Tellings of the Wheel. Rand's heart pounded as he ran, and he stared in dismay at the barren hills surrounding him. This was not just a place where spring was late in coming. Spring had never come here, and never would come. Nothing grew in the cold soil that crunched under his boots, not so much as a bit of lichen. He scrambled past boulders twice as tall as he was. Dust coated the stone, as if never a drop of rain had touched it. The sun was a swollen, blood-red ball, more fiery than on the hottest day of summer, and bright enough to sear his eyes. But it stood dark against a leaden cauldron of a sky where clouds of sharp black and silver roiled and boiled on every horizon. For all the swirling clouds, though, no breath of breeze stirred across the land, and despite the sullen sun, the air burned cold like the depths of winter. Rand looked over his shoulder often as he ran, but he could not see his pursuers. Only desolate hills and jagged black mountains, many topped by tall plumes of dark smoke rising to join the milling clouds. If he could not see his hunters, though, he could hear them, howling behind him, guttural voices shouting with the glee of the chase, howling with the joy of blood to come. Trollocs, coming closer, and his strength was almost gone. With desperate haste, he scrambled to the top of a knife-edged ridge, then dropped to his knees with a groan. Below him, a sheer rock wall fell away, a 1,000-foot cliff plummeting into a vast canyon. Steamy mists covered the canyon floor, their thick gray surface rolling in grim waves, rolling and breaking against the cliff beneath him, but more slowly than any ocean wave had ever moved. Patches of fog glowed red for an instant, as if great fires had suddenly flared beneath, then died. Thunder rumbled in the depths of the valley, and lightning crackled through the gray, sometimes striking up at the sky. It was not the valley itself that sapped his strength and filled the empty spaces left with helplessness. From the center of the furious vapors, a mountain thrust upward. A mountain taller than any he had ever seen in the mountains of mist. A mountain as black as the loss of all hope. That bleak stone spire, a dagger stabbing at the heavens, was the source of his desolation. He had never seen it before, but he knew it. The memory of it flashed away like quicksilver when he tried to touch it, but the memory was there. He knew it was there. Unseen fingers touched him, pulled at his arms and legs, trying to draw him to the mountain. His body twitched, ready to obey. His arms and legs stiffened, as if he thought he could dig his fingers and toes into the stone. Ghostly strings entwined around his heart, pulling him, calling him to the Spire Mountain. Tears ran down his face, and he sagged to the ground. He felt his will draining away like water out of a holed bucket. Just a little longer, and he would go where he was called. He would obey, do as he was told. Abruptly, he discovered another emotion. Anger. Push him, pull him? He was not a sheep to be prodded into a pen. The anger squeezed itself into one hard knot, and he clung to it as he would have clung to a raft in a flood. "Serve me," a voice whispered in the stillness of his mind. A familiar voice. If he listened hard enough, he was sure he would know it. "Serve me." He shook his head to try to get it out of his head. "Serve me!" He shook his fist at the Black Mountain. "The light consume you, Shaitan!" Abruptly, the smell of death lay thick around him. A figure loomed over him, in a cloak the color of dried blood. A figure with a face. He did not want to see the face that looked down at him. He did not want to think of that face. It hurt to think of it, turned his mind to embers. A hand reached toward him. Not caring if he fell over the edge, he threw himself away. He had to get away, far away. He fell, flailing at the air, wanting to scream, finding no breath for screaming, no breath at all. Abruptly, he was no longer in the barren land, no longer falling. Winter-brown grass flattened under his boots. It seemed like flowers. He almost laughed to see scattered trees and bushes, leafless as they were, dotting the gently rolling plain that now surrounded him. In the distance reared a single mountain, its peak broken and split, but this mountain brought no fear or despair. It was just a mountain, though oddly out of place there, with no other in sight. A broad river flowed by the mountain, and on an island in the middle of that river was a city such as might live in a gleeman's tale, a city surrounded by high walls gleaming white and silver beneath the warm sun. With mingled relief and joy, he started for the walls, for the safety and serenity he somehow knew he would find behind them. As he came closer, he made out soaring towers, many joined by wondrous walkways that spanned the open air. High bridges arced from both banks of the river to the island city. Even at a distance, he could see lacy stonework on those spans, seemingly too delicate to withstand the swift waters that rushed beneath them. Beyond those bridges lay safety, sanctuary. Of a sudden, a chill ran along his bones. An icy clamminess settled on his skin, and the air around him turned fetid and dank. Without looking back, he ran from the pursuer whose freezing fingers brushed his back and tugged at his cloak. Ran from the light-eating figure with the face that... He could not remember the face, except his terror. He did not want to remember the face. He ran, and the ground passed beneath his feet, rolling hills and flat plain. And he wanted to howl like a dog gone mad. The city was receding before him. The harder he ran, the further away drifted the white shining walls and haven. They grew smaller and smaller until only a pale speck remained on the horizon. The cold hand of his pursuer clutched at his collar. If those fingers touched him, he knew he would go mad, or worse, much worse. Even as that surety came to him, he tripped and fell. "No!" he screamed, and grunted as paving stones smacked the breath out of him. Wonderingly, he got to his feet. He stood on the approaches to one of the marvelous bridges he had seen rearing over the river. Smiling people walked by on either side of him, people dressed in so many colors they made him think of a field of wildflowers. Some of them spoke to him, but he could not understand, though the words sounded as if he should. But the faces were friendly, and the people gestured him onward, over the bridge with its intricate stonework, onward toward the shining, silver-streaked walls and the towers beyond, toward the safety he knew waited there. He joined the throng streaming across the bridge and into the city through massive gates set in tall, pristine walls. Within was a wonderland where the meanest structure seemed a palace. It was as though the builders had been told to take stone and brick and tile and create beauty to take the breath of mortal men. There was no building, no monument that did not make him stare with goggling eyes. Music drifted down the streets, 100 different songs, but all blending with the clamor of the crowds to make one grand, joyous harmony. The sense of sweet perfumes and sharp spices, of wondrous foods and myriad flowers all floated in the air, as if every good smell in the world were gathered there. The street by which he entered the city, broad and paved with smooth gray stone, stretched straight before him toward the center of the city. At its end loomed a tower larger and taller than any other in the city. A tower as white as fresh fallen snow. That tower was where safety lay, and the knowledge he sought. But the city was such as he had never dreamed of seeing. Surely it would not matter if he delayed just a short time in going to the tower. He turned aside into a narrower street, where jugglers strolled among hawkers of strange fruit. Ahead of him down the street was a snow-white tower. The same tower. Just a little while, after another corner. At the far end of the street, too, lay the white. Stubbornly, another corner. Another. Each time, the alabaster tower met his eye. He spun to run away from it, and skidded to a halt. Before him, the white tower. He was afraid to look over his shoulder, afraid it would be there, too. The faces around him were still friendly, but shattered hope filled them now. Hope he had broken. Still the people gestured him forward, pleading gestures. Toward the tower. Their eyes shone with desperate need, and only he could fulfill it. Only he could save them. Very well, he thought. The tower was, after all, where he wanted to go. Even as he took his first step forward, disappointment faded from those about him, and smiles wreathed every face. They moved with him, and small children strewed his path with flower petals. He looked over his shoulder in confusion, wondering who the flowers were meant for, but behind him were only more smiling people, gesturing him on. They must be for me, he thought, and wondered why that suddenly did not seem strange at all. But wonderment lasted only a moment before melting away. All was as it should be. First one, then another of the people began to sing until every voice was lifted into a glorious anthem. He still could not understand the words, but a dozen interweaving harmonies shouted joy and salvation. Musicians capered through the onflowing crowd, adding flutes and harps and drums in a dozen sizes to the hymn, and all the songs he had heard before blended in without seam. Girls danced around him, laying garlands of sweet-smelling blossoms across his shoulders, twining them about his neck. They smiled at him, their delight growing with every step he took. He could not help but smile back. His feet itched to join in their dance, and even as he thought of it, he was dancing, his steps fitting in as if he had known it all from birth. He threw back his head and laughed. His feet were lighter than they had ever been, dancing with... He could not remember the name, but it did not seem important. Destiny. A voice whispered in his head, and the whisper was a thread in the paean. Carrying him like a twig on the crest of a wave, the crowd flowed into a huge square in the middle of the city, and for the first time he saw that the white tower rose from a great palace of pale marble, sculpted rather than built, curving walls and swelling domes and delicate spires fingering the sky. The whole of it made him gasp in awe. Broad stairs of pristine stone led up from the square, and at the foot of those stairs the people halted. Their song rose ever higher. The swelling voices buoyed his feet. "Your destiny," the voice whispered, insistent now, eager. He no longer danced, but neither did he stop. He mounted the stairs without hesitation. This was where he belonged. Scrollwork covered the massive doors at the top of the stairs, carvings so intricate and delicate that he could not imagine a knife blade fine enough to fit. The portals swung open, and he went in. They closed behind him with an echoing crash like thunder. "We have been waiting for you," the Myrddraal hissed. Rand sat bolt upright, gasping for breath and shivering, staring. Tam was still asleep on the bed. Slowly his breathing slowed. Half-consumed logs blazed in the fireplace with a good bed of coals built up around the fire irons. Someone had been there to tend to it while he slept. A blanket lay at his feet where it had fallen when he woke. The makeshift litter was gone too, and his and Tam's cloaks had been hung by the door. He wiped cold sweat from his face with a hand that was none too steady, and wondered if naming the Dark One in a dream brought his attention the same way that naming him aloud did. Twilight darkened the window. The moon was well up, round and fat, and evening stars sparkled above the mountains of mist. He had slept the day away. He rubbed a sore spot on his side. Apparently he had slept with the sword hilt jabbing him in the ribs. Between that and an empty stomach and the night before, it was no wonder he had had nightmares. His belly rumbled, and he got up stiffly and made his way to the table where Mistress Alvear had left the tray. He twitched aside the white napkin. Despite the time he had slept, the beef broth was still warm, and so was the crusty bread. Mistress Alvear's hand was plain. The tray had been replaced. Once she decided you needed a hot meal, she did not give up till it was inside you. He gulped down some broth, and it was all he could do to put some meat and cheese between two pieces of bread before stuffing it in his mouth. Taking big bites, he went back to the bed. Mistress Alvear had apparently seen to Tam as well. Tam had been undressed, his clothes now clean and neatly folded on the bedside table. His blanket was drawn up under his chin. When Rand touched his father's forehead, Tam opened his eyes. "There you are. Rand said you were here. I couldn't even sit up to see. She said you were too tired for her to wake, just so I could look at you. Even Bran can't get around her when she has her mind set." Tam's voice was weak, but his gaze was clear and steady. The Aes Sedai was right, Rand thought. With rest, he would be as good as ever. "Can I get you something to eat? Mistress Alvear left the tray." "Good meal already, if you can call it that. Wouldn't let me see anything but broth. And a man has bad dreams with nothing but broth in his..." Tam fumbled up and touched the sword at Tam's waist. "It wasn't a dream. When Morin told me I was sick, I thought I had been... But you're all right. That is all that matters. What of the farm?" Rand took a deep breath. "The Trollocs killed the sheep. I think they took the cow, too. And the house needs a good cleaning." He managed a weak smile. "We were luckier than some. They burned half the village." He told Tam everything that had happened, or at least most of it. Tam listened closely and asked sharp questions, so he found himself having to tell about returning to the farmhouse from the woods, and that brought in the Trolloc he had killed. He had to tell how Nynaeve had said Tam was dying to explain why the Aes Sedai had tended him instead of the Wisdom. Tam's eyes widened at that, and Aes Sedai in Emond's Field. But Rand could see no need to go over every step of the journey from the farm, or his fears, or the Myrddraal on the road. Certainly not his nightmares as he slept by the bed. Especially he saw no reason to mention Tam's ramblings under the fever. Not yet. Moraine's story, though, there was no avoiding that. "Now that's a tale to make a Gleeman proud," Tam muttered when he was done. "What would Trollocs want with you boys? Or the Dark One might help us." "You think she was lying? Master Alvear said she was telling the truth about only 2 farms being attacked, and about Master Luhan's house and Master Cawthon's." For a moment Tam lay silent before saying, Tell me what she said. Her exact words, mind. Just as she said them. Rand struggled. Whoever remembered the exact words they heard? He chewed at his lip and scratched his head, and bit by bit he brought it out as nearly as he could remember. I can't think of anything else, he finished. Some of it I'm not too sure she didn't say a little differently, but it's close anyway. It's good enough. It has to be, doesn't it? You see, lad, Aes Sedai are tricksome. They don't lie, not right out, but the truth an Aes Sedai tells you is not always the truth you think it is. You take care around her. I've heard the stories, Rand retorted. I'm not a child. So you're not. So you're not, Tam sighed heavily, then shrugged in annoyance. I should be going along with you just the same. The world outside the Two Rivers is nothing like Emond's Field. That was an opening to ask about Tam going outside and all the rest of it, but Tam did not take it. His mouth fell open instead. Just like that? I thought you would try to talk me out of it. I thought you'd have 100 reasons I should not go. He realized he had been hoping Tam would have 100 reasons, and good ones. Maybe not 100, Tam said with a snort, but a few did come to mind. Only they don't count for much. If Trollocs are after you, you will be safer in Tar Valon than you could ever be here. Just remember to be wary. Aes Sedai do things for their own reasons, and those are not always the reasons you think. The Gleeman said something like that, Rand said slowly. Then he knows what he's talking about. You listen sharp, think deep, and guard your tongue. That's good advice for any dealings beyond the Two Rivers, but most especially with Aes Sedai. And with warders. Tell Lan something, and you've as good as told Moraine. If he's a warder, then he's bonded to her as sure as the sun rose this morning. And he won't keep many secrets from her, if any. Rand knew little about the bonding between Aes Sedai and warders, though it played a big part in every story about warders he had ever heard. It was something to do with the power, a gift to the warder, or maybe some sort of exchange. The warders got all sorts of benefits, according to the stories. They healed more quickly than other men, and could go longer without food or water or sleep. Supposedly, they could sense Trollocs if they were close enough, and other creatures of the Dark One too, which explained how Lan and Moraine had tried to warn the village before the attack. As to what the Aes Sedai got out of it, the stories were silent. But he was not about to believe they did not get something. I'll be careful, Rand said. I just wish I knew why. It doesn't make any sense. Why me? Why us? I wish I knew too, boy. Blood and ashes, I wish I knew. Tam sighed heavily. Well, no use trying to put a broken egg back in the shell, I suppose. How soon do you have to go? I'll be back in my feet in a day or two, and we can see about starting a new flock. Oren Daughtry has some good stock he might be willing to part with the pastures all gone. And so does John Thane. Moraine, the Aes Sedai said you had to stay in bed. She said weeks. Tam opened his mouth, but Rand went on. And she talked to Mistress Alvear. Oh, well, maybe I can talk Marin around. Tam did not sound hopeful of it, though. He gave Rand a sharp look. The way you avoided answering means you have to leave soon. Tomorrow? Or tonight? Tonight, Rand said quietly, and Tam nodded sadly. Yes. Well, if it must be done, best not to delay. But we will see about this week's business. He plucked at his blankets with more irritation than strength. Perhaps I'll follow in a few days anyway. Catch you up on the road. We'll see if Marn can keep me in bed when I want to get up. There was a tap at the door, and Lan stuck his head into the room. Say your goodbyes quickly, sheepherder, and come. There may be trouble. Trouble? Rand said, and the warder growled at him impatiently. Just hurry. Hastily, Rand snatched up his cloak. He started to undo the sword belt, but Tam spoke up. Keep it. You will probably have more need of it than I. Though the light willing, neither of us will. Take care, lad. You hear? Ignoring Lan's continued growls, Rand bent to grab Tam in a hug. I will come back. I promise you that. Of course you will, Tam laughed. He returned the hug weakly and ended by patting Rand on the back. I know that. And I'll have twice as many sheep for you to tend when you return. Now go, before that fellow does himself an injury. Rand tried to hang back, tried to find the words for the question he did not want to ask, but Lan entered the room to catch him by the arm and pull him into the hall. The warder had donned a dull gray-green tunic of overlapping metal scales. His voice rasped with irritation. We have to hurry. Don't you understand the word trouble? Outside the room, Matt waited, cloaked and coated, and carrying his bow. A quiver hung at his waist. He was rocking anxiously on his heels, and he kept glancing off toward the stairs with what seemed to be equal parts impatience and fear. This isn't much like the stories, Rand, is it? He said hoarsely. What kind of trouble? Rand demanded. But the warder ran ahead of him instead of answering, taking the steps down 2 at a time. Matt dashed after him with quick gestures for Rand to follow. Shrugging into his cloak, he caught up to them downstairs. Only a feeble light filled the common room. Half the candles had burned out, and most of the rest were guttering. It was empty except for the 3 of them. Matt stood next to one of the front windows, peeping out as if trying not to be seen. Lan held the door open a crack and peered into the inn yard. Wondering what they could be watching, Rand went to join him. The warder muttered at him to take a care, but he did open the door a trifle wider to make room for Rand to look, too. At first, he was not sure exactly what he was seeing. A crowd of village men, some 3 dozen or so, clustered near the burned-out husk of the peddler's wagon, night pushed back by the torches some of them carried. Moraine faced them, her back to the inn, leaning with seeming casualness on her walking staff. Hari Copland stood in the front of the group with his brother Darl and Billy Conger. Sen Bowie was there as well, looking uncomfortable. Rand was startled to see Hari shake his fist at Moraine. "Leave Emmons Field!" the sour-faced farmer shouted. A few voices in the crowd echoed him, but hesitantly, and no one pushed forward. They might be willing to confront an Aes Sedai from within a crowd, but none of them wanted to be singled out. Not by an Aes Sedai who had every reason to take offense. "You brought those monsters!" Darl roared. He waved a torch over his head, and there were shouts of, "You brought them, and it's your fault!" led by his cousin Billy. Hari elbowed Sen Bowie, and the old thatcher pursed his lips and gave him a sidelong glare. Those Trollocs didn't appear until after you came," Sen muttered, barely loud enough to be heard. He swung his head from side to side dourly as if wishing he were somewhere else and looking for a way to get there. "You're an Aes Sedai. We want none of your sort in the 2 rivers. Aes Sedai bring trouble on their backs. If you stay, it will only bring more." His speech brought no response from the gathered villagers, and Hari scowled in frustration. Abruptly, he snatched Darl's torch and shook it in her direction. "Get out!" he shouted. "Or we'll burn you out!" Dead silence fell, except for the shuffling of a few feet as men drew back. 2 Rivers folk could fight back if they were attacked, but violence was far from common, and threatening people was foreign to them, beyond the occasional shaking of a fist. Sen Bowie, Billy Conger, and the Coplands were left out front alone. Billy looked as if he wanted to back away, too. Hari gave an uneasy start at the lack of support, but he recovered quickly. "Get out!" he shouted again, echoed by Darl, and more weakly by Billy. Hari glared at the others. Most of the crowd failed to meet his eye. Suddenly, Bran Al'Vir and Harol Luhan moved out of the shadows, stopping apart from both the Aes Sedai and the crowd. In one hand, the mayor casually carried the big wooden maul he used to drive spigots into casks. "Did someone suggest burning my inn?" he asked softly. The 2 Coplands took a step back, and Sen Bowie edged away from them. Billy Conger dived into the crowd. "Not that," Darl said quickly. "We never said that, Bran. Mayor." Bran nodded. "Then perhaps I heard you threatening to harm guests in my inn?" "She's an Aes Sedai," Hari began angrily, but his words cut off as Harol Luhan moved. The blacksmith simply stretched, thrusting thick arms over his head, tightening massive fists until his knuckles cracked, but Hari looked at the burly man as if one of those fists had been shaken under his nose. Harol folded his arms across his chest. "Your pardon, Hari. I did not mean to cut you off. You were saying..." But Hari, shoulders hunched as though he were trying to draw into himself and disappear, seemed to have nothing more to say. I'm surprised at you people, Bran rumbled. Pate Alcar, your boy's leg was broken last night, but I saw him walking on it today because of her. Eward Candin, you were lying on your belly with a gash down your back like a fish for cleaning, till she laid hands on you. Now it looks as if it happened a month ago. And unless I misdoubt, there'll be barely a scar. And you, Sen. The Thatcher started to fade back into the crowd, but stopped, held uncomfortably by Bran's gaze. I'd be shocked to see any man on the village council here, Sen. But you, most of all. Your arm would still be hanging useless at your side, a mass of burns and bruises, if not for her. If you have no gratitude, have you no shame? Sen half lifted his right hand, then looked away from it angrily. I cannot deny what she did, he muttered, and he did sound ashamed. She helped me and others, he went on in a pleading tone. But she's an Aes Sedai, Bran. If those Trollocs didn't come because of her, why did they come? We want no part of Aes Sedai in the Two Rivers. Let them keep their troubles away from us. A few men, safely back in the crowd, shouted then. We want no Aes Sedai troubles. Send her away. Drive her out. Why did they come if not because of her? A scowl grew on Bran's face, but before he could speak, Moiraine suddenly whirled her vine-carved staff above her head, spinning it with both hands. Bran's gasp echoed that of the villagers, for a hissing white flame flared from each end of the staff, standing straight out like spear points despite the rods whirling. Even Bran and Harel edged away from her. She snapped her arms down straight out before her, the staff parallel to the ground, but the pale fire still jetted out, brighter than the torches. Men shied away, held up hands to shield their eyes from the pain of that brilliance. Is this what Aemon's blood has come to? The Aes Sedai's voice was not loud, but it overwhelmed every other sound. Little people squabbling for the right to hide like rabbits? You have forgotten who you were, forgotten what you were. But I had hoped some small part was left, some memory in blood and bone, some shred to steel you for the long night coming. No one spoke. The two Coplans looked as if they had never wanted to open their mouths again. Bran said, Forgotten who we were. We are who we always have been. Honest farmers and shepherds and craftsmen. Two Rivers folk. To the south, Moiraine said, lies the river you call the White River. But far to the east of here, men call it still by its rightful name, Manetheren-Drell. In the old tongue, waters of the mountain home. Sparkling waters that once coursed through a land of bravery and beauty. 2,000 years ago, Manetheren-Drell flowed by the walls of a mountain city, so lovely to behold that Ogier stonemasons came to stare in wonder. Farms and villages covered this region, and that you call the Forest of Shadows as well, and beyond. But all of those folk thought of themselves as the people of the mountain home, the people of Manetheren. Their king was Aemon Alcar al-Thorin, Aemon, son of Car, son of Thorin, and Eldraine, Elan, Carlan, was his queen. Aemon, a man so fearless that the greatest compliment for courage any could give, even among his enemies, was to say a man had Aemon's heart. Eldraine, so beautiful that it was said the flowers bloomed to make her smile. Bravery and beauty and wisdom, and a love that death could not sunder. Weep if you have a heart for the loss of them, for the loss of even their memory. Weep for the loss of their blood. She fell silent then, but no one spoke. Rand was as bound as the others in the spell she had created. When she spoke again, he drank it in, and so did the rest. For nearly 2 centuries, the Trolloc Wars had ravaged the length and breadth of the world, and wherever battles raged, the Red Eagle banner of Manetheren was in the forefront. The men of Manetheren were a thorn to the Dark One's foot, and a bramble to his hand. Sing of Manetheren, that would never bend knee to the shadow. Sing of Manetheren, the sword that could not be broken. They were far away, the men of Manetheren, on the field of Bekkar, called the Field of Blood, when news came that a Trolloc army was moving against their home. Too far to do else but wait to hear of their land's death, for the forces of the Dark One meant to make an end of them. Kill the mighty oak by hacking away its roots. Too far to do else but mourn. But they were the men of the mountain home. Without hesitation, Without thought for the distance they must travel, they marched from the very field of victory, still covered in dust and sweat and blood. Day and night they marched, for they had seen the horror a Trolloc army left behind it, and no man of them could sleep while such a danger threatened Manetheren. They moved as if their feet had wings, marching further and faster than friends hoped or enemies feared they could. At any other day, that march alone would have inspired songs. When the Dark One's armies swooped down upon the lands of Manetheren, the men of the mountain home stood before it with their backs to the Tarendrel. Some villager raised a small cheer then, but Moraine kept on as if she had not heard. The host that faced the men of Manetheren was enough to daunt the bravest heart. Ravens blackened the sky. Trollocs blackened the land. Trollocs and their human allies. Trollocs and dark friends in tens of thousands, and dread lords to command. At night their cook-fires outnumbered the stars, and dawn revealed the banner of Baalzaman at their head. Baalzaman, Heart of the Dark. An ancient name for the father of lies. The Dark One could not have been free of his prison at Sheol, for if he had been, not all the forces of humankind together could have stood against him. But there was power there. Dread lords, and some evil that made that light-destroying banner seem no more than right, and sent a chill into the souls of men who faced it. Yet they knew what they must do. Their homeland lay just across the river. They must keep that host and the power with it from the mountain home. Aemon had sent out messengers. Aid was promised if they could hold for but 3 days at the Tarendrel. Hold for 3 days against odds that should overwhelm them in the first hour. Yet somehow, through bloody assault and desperate defense, they held through an hour, and the second hour, and the third. For 3 days they fought, and though the land became a butcher's yard, no crossing of the Tarendrel did they yield. By the third night, no help had come, and no messengers, and they fought on alone. For 6 days, for 9, and on the 10th day, Aemon knew the bitter taste of betrayal. No help was coming, and they could hold the river crossings no more. "Where did they go?" Ari demanded. Torch fires flickered in the chill night breeze, but no one made a move to draw a cloak tighter. Aemon crossed the Tarendrel, Moraine told them, destroying the bridges behind him, and he sent word throughout his land for the people to flee, for he knew the powers with the Trolloc horde would find a way to bring it across the river. Even as the word went out, the Trolloc crossing began, and the soldiers of Manetheren took up the fight again, to buy with their lives what hours they could for their people to escape. From the city of Manetheren, Eldraine organized the flight of her people into the deepest forests and the fastness of the mountains. But some did not flee. First in a trickle, then in a river, then a flood, men went not to safety, but to join the army fighting for their land. Shepherds with bows and farmers with pitchforks, and woodsmen with axes. Women went too, shouldering what weapons they could find and marching side by side with their men. No one made that journey who did not know they would never return. But it was their land. It had been their fathers', and it would be their children's. And they went to pay the price of it. Not a step of ground was given up until it was soaked in blood. But at the last, the army of Manetheren was driven back. Back to here. To this place you now call Emond's Field. And here the Trolloc hordes surrounded them. Her voice held the sound of cold tears. Trolloc dead and the corpses of human renegades piled up in mounds, but always more scrambled over those charnel heaps in waves of death that had no end. There could be but one finish. No man or woman who had stood beneath the banner of the Red Eagle at that day's dawning still lived when night fell. The sword that could not be broken was shattered. In the mountains of mist, alone in the emptied city of Manetheren, Eldraine felt Aemon die, and her heart died with him. And where her heart had been was left only a thirst for vengeance. Vengeance for her love. Vengeance for her people and her land. Driven by grief, she reached out to the true source and hurled the one power at the Trolloc army. And there the Dreadlords died wherever they stood, whether in their secret councils or exhorting their soldiers. In the passing of a breath, the Dreadlords and the generals of the Dark One's host burst into flame. Fire consumed their bodies, and terror consumed their just victorious army. Now they ran like beasts before a wildfire in the forest, with no thought for anything but escape. North and south they fled. Thousands drowned attempting to cross the Tarandrel without the aid of the Dreadlords. And at the Monethandrel, they tore down the bridges in their fright at what might be following them. Where they found people, they slew and burned. But to flee was the need that gripped them. Until at last, no one of them remained in the lands of Manetheren. They were dispersed like dust before the whirlwind. The final vengeance came more slowly, but it came. When they were hunted down by other peoples, by other armies in other lands, none was left alive of those who did murder at Amon's Field. But the price was high for Manetheren. Eldraine had drawn to herself more of the one power than any human could ever hope to wield unaided. As the enemy generals died, so did she die. And the fires that consumed her consumed the empty city of Manetheren, even the stones of it, down to the living rock of the mountains. Yet the people had been saved. Nothing was left of their farms, their villages, or their great city. Some would say there was nothing left for them, nothing but to flee to other lands, where they could begin anew. They did not say so. They had paid such a price in blood and hope for their land as had never been paid before, and now they were bound to that soil by ties stronger than steel. Other wars would rack them in years to come, until at last their corner of the world was forgotten. And at last, they had forgotten wars and the ways of war. Never again did Manetheren rise. Its soaring spires and splashing fountains became as a dream that slowly faded from the minds of its people. But they and their children, and their children's children, held the land that was theirs. They held it when the long centuries had washed the why of it from their memories. They held it until today. There is you. Weep for Manetheren. Weep for what is lost forever. The fires on Moraine's staff winked out, and she lowered it to her side as if it weighed 100 pounds. For a long moment, the moan of the wind was the only sound. Then Pate Alcar shouldered past the Coplans. "I don't know about your story," the long-jawed farmer said. "I'm no thorn to the Dark One's foot, nor ever likely to be, neither. But my will is walking because of you, and for that I'm ashamed to be here. I don't know if you can forgive me, but whether you will or no, I'll be going. And for me, you can stay in Emond's Field as long as you like." With a quick duck of his head, almost a bow, he pushed back through the crowd. Others began to mutter then, offering shamefaced penitence before they, too, slipped away one by one. The Coplans, sour-mouthed and scowling once more, looked at the faces around them and vanished into the night without a word. Billy Conger had disappeared even before his cousins. Bland pulled Rand back and shut the door. "Let's go, boy." The warder started for the back of the inn. "Come along, both of you, quickly." Rand hesitated, exchanging a wondering glance with Matt. While Moraine had been telling the story, Master Alvir's Durans could not have dragged him away, but now something else held his feet. This was the real beginning, leaving the inn and following the warder into the night. He shook himself and tried to firm his resolve. He had no choice but to go, but he would come back to Emond's Field, however far or long this journey was. "What are you waiting for?" Lan asked from the door that led out of the back of the common room. With a start, Matt hurried to him. Trying to convince himself that he was beginning a grand adventure, Rand followed them through the darkened kitchen and out into the stable yard. Chapter 10. Leave-taking. A single lantern, its shutters half closed, hung from a nail on a stall post, casting a dim light. Deep shadows swallowed most of the stalls. As Rand came through the doors from the stable yard, hard on the heels of Matt and the warder, Perrin leaped up in a rustle of straw from where he had been sitting with his back against a stall door. A heavy cloak swathed him. Land barely paused to demand, "Did you look the way I told you, blacksmith?" "I looked," Perrin replied. "There's nobody here but us. Why would anybody hide?" "Care and a long life go together, blacksmith." The warder ran a quick eye around the shadowed stable and the deeper shadows of the hayloft above, then shook his head. "No time," he muttered half to himself. "Hurry," she says. As if to suit his words, he strode quickly to where the 5 horses stood tethered, bridled, and saddled at the back of the pool of light. 2 were the black stallion and white mare that Rand had seen before. The others, if not quite so tall or so sleek, certainly appeared to be among the best the 2 rivers had to offer. With hasty care, Rand began examining cinches and girth straps, and the leather ties that held saddlebags, water skins, and blanket rolls behind the saddles. Rand exchanged shaky smiles with his friends, trying hard to look as if he really was eager to be off. For the first time, Matt noticed the sword at Rand's waist and pointed to it. "You becoming a warder?" He laughed, then swallowed it with a quick glance at Lan. The warder apparently took no notice. "Or at least a merchant's guard," Matt went on with a grin that seemed only a little forced. He hefted his bow. "An honest man's weapon isn't good enough for him." Rand thought about flourishing the sword, but Lan being there stopped him. The warder was not even looking in his direction, but he was sure the man was aware of everything that went on around him. Instead, he said with exaggerated casualness, "It might be useful," as if wearing a sword were nothing out of the ordinary. Perrin moved, trying to hide something under his cloak. Rand glimpsed a wide leather belt encircling the apprentice blacksmith's waist, with the handle of an axe thrust through a loop on the belt. "What do you have there?" he asked. "Merchant's guard indeed," Matt hooted. The shaggy-haired youth gave Matt a frown that suggested he had already had more than his share of joking, then sighed heavily and tossed back his cloak to uncover the axe. It was no common woodsman's tool. A broad half-moon blade on one side of the head and a curved spike on the other made it every bit as strange for the 2 rivers as Rand's sword. Perrin's hand rested on it with a sense of familiarity, though. "Master Luhan made it about 2 years ago for a wood buyer's guard. But when it was done, the fellow wouldn't pay what he had agreed, and Master Luhan would not take less. He gave it to me when—" He cleared his throat, then shot Rand the same warning frown he'd given Matt. "When he found me practicing with it. He said I might as well have it since he couldn't make anything useful from it." "Practicing," Matt snickered, but held up his hands soothingly when Perrin raised his head. "As you say. It's just as well one of us knows how to use a real weapon." "That bow is a real weapon," Lan said suddenly. He propped an arm across the saddle of his tall black and regarded them gravely. "So are the slings I've seen you village boys with. Just because you never use them for anything but hunting rabbits or chasing a wolf away from the sheep makes no difference. Anything can be a weapon if the man or woman who holds it has the nerve and will make it so. Trollocs aside, you had better have that clear in your minds before we leave the 2 rivers, before we leave Emmons Field, if you want to reach Tar Valon alive." His face and voice, cold as death and hard as a rough-hewn gravestone, stifled their smiles and their tongues. Perrin grimaced and pulled his cloak back over the axe. Matt stared at his feet and stirred the straw on the stable floor with his toe. The warder grunted and went back to his checking, and the silence lengthened. "It isn't much like the stories," Matt said finally. "I don't know," Perrin said sourly. "Trolloc, a warder, an Aes Sedai. What more could you ask?" "Aes Sedai," Matt whispered, sounding as if he were suddenly cold. "Do you believe her, Rand?" Perrin asked. "I mean, what would Trollocs want with us?" As one, they glanced at the warder. Lan appeared absorbed in the white mare's saddle girth, but the 3 of them moved back toward the stable door, away from Lan. Even so, they huddled together and spoke softly. Rand shook his head. "I don't know. But she had it right about our farms being the only ones attacked. And they attacked Master Luhan's house and the forge first, here in the village. I asked the mayor. It's as easy to believe they are after us as anything else I can think of." Suddenly he realized they were both staring at him. "You asked the mayor?" Matt said incredulously. "He said not to tell anybody." "I didn't tell him why I was asking," "You mean you didn't talk to anybody at all? You didn't let anybody know you were going?" Perrin shrugged defensively. "Moraine Sedai said not anybody." "We left notes," Matt said, "for our families. They'll find them in the morning. Matt, my mother thinks Tar Valon is the next thing to Shale Ghul." He gave a little laugh to show he did not share her opinion. It was not very convincing. "She'd try to lock me in the cellar if she believed I was even thinking of going there." "Master Luhan is stubborn as a stone," Perrin added, "and Mistress Luhan is worse. If you'd seen her digging through what's left of the house, saying she hoped the Trollocs did come back so she could get her hands on them." Burn me, Rand, Matt said. I know she's an Aes Sedai and all, but the Trollocs were really here. She said not to tell anybody. If an Aes Sedai doesn't know what to do about something like this, who does? I don't know. Rand rubbed at his forehead. His head hurt. He could not get that dream out of his mind. My father was, and at least he agreed that we had to go. Suddenly, Moraine was in the doorway. You talked to your father about this journey? She was clothed in dark gray from head to foot, with a skirt divided for riding astride, and the serpent ring was the only gold she wore now. Rand eyed her walking staff. Despite the flames he had seen, there was no sign of charring, or even soot. I couldn't go off without letting him know. She eyed him for a moment, with pursed lips before turning to the others. And did you also decide that a note was not enough? Matt and Perrin talked on top of each other, assuring her they had only left notes, the way she had said. Nodding, she waved them to silence and gave Rand a sharp look. What is done is already woven in the pattern. Lan?
The horses are ready, the warder said, and we have enough provisions to reach Baerlon with some to spare. We can leave at any time. I suggest now.
Not without me. Egwene slipped into the stable, a shawl-wrapped bundle in her arms. Rand nearly fell over his own feet. Lan's sword had come half out of its sheath. When he saw who it was, he shoved the blade back, his eyes suddenly flat. Perrin and Matt began babbling to convince Moraine they had not told Egwene about leaving. The Aes Sedai ignored them. She simply looked at Egwene, tapping her lips thoughtfully with one finger. The hood of Egwene's dark brown cloak was pulled up, but not enough to hide the defiant way she faced Moraine. I have everything I need here, including food, and I will not be left behind. I'll probably never get another chance to see the world outside the Two Rivers. This isn't a picnic trip into the Waterwood, Egwene, Matt growled. He stepped back when she looked at him from under lowered brows. Thank you, Matt. I wouldn't have known. Do you think you three are the only ones who want to see what's outside? I've dreamed about it as long as you have, and I don't intend to miss this chance. How did you find out we were leaving? Rand demanded. Anyway, you can't go with us. We aren't leaving for the fun of it. The Trollocs are after us. She gave him a tolerant look, and he flushed and stiffened indignantly. First, she told him patiently, I saw Matt creeping about, trying hard not to be noticed. Then I saw Perrin attempting to hide that absurd great axe under his cloak. I knew Lan had bought a horse, and it suddenly occurred to me to wonder why he needed another. And if he could buy one, he could buy others. Putting that with Matt and Perrin sneaking about like bull cows pretending to be foxes, well, I could only see one answer. I don't know if I'm surprised or not to find you here, Rand, after all your talk about daydreams. With Matt and Perrin involved, I suppose I should have known you would be in it too. I have to go, Egwene, Rand said. All of us do, or the Trollocs will come back. The Trollocs? Egwene laughed incredulously. Rand, if you've decided to see some of the world, well and good. But please spare me any of your nonsensical tales. It's true, Perrin said, as Matt began. The Trollocs... Enough, Moraine said quietly, but it cut their talk as sharply as a knife. Did anyone else notice all of this? Her voice was soft, but Egwene swallowed and drew herself up before answering. After last night, all they can think about is rebuilding. That and what to do if it happens again. They couldn't see anything else unless it was pushed under their noses. And I told no one what I suspected. No one. Very well, Moraine said after a moment. You may come with us. A startled expression darted across Lan's face. It was gone in an instant, leaving him outwardly calm, but furious words erupted from him. No, Moraine. It is part of the pattern now, Lan. It is ridiculous, he retorted. There's no reason for her to come along, and every reason for her not to. There is a reason for it, Moraine said calmly. A part of the pattern, Lan. The warder's stony face showed nothing, but he nodded slowly. But Egwene, Rand said, the Trollocs will be chasing us. We won't be safe until we get to Tar Valon. Don't try to frighten me off, she said. I am going. Rand knew that tone of voice. He had heard it since she decided that climbing the tallest trees was for children. But he remembered it well. If you think being chased by Trollocs will be fun, he began, but Moraine interrupted. We have no time for this. We must be as far away as possible by daybreak. If she is left behind, Rand, she could rouse the village before we have gone a mile, and that would surely warn the Myrddraal. I would not do that, Egwene protested. She can ride the Gleeman's horse, the warder said. I'll leave him enough to buy another. That will not be possible, came Tom Maryland's resonant voice from the hayloft. Lan's sword left its sheath this time, and he did not put it back as he stared up at the gleeman. Tom tossed down a blanket roll, then slung his cased flute and harp across his back and shouldered bulging saddlebags.
This village has no use for me now, while on the other hand, I have never performed in Tar Valon. And though I usually journey alone, after last night I have no objections at all to traveling in company.
The warder gave Perrin a hard look, and Perrin shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think of looking in the loft, he muttered. As the long-limbed gleeman scrambled down the ladder from the loft, Lan spoke, stiffly formal.
Is this part of the pattern, too? Moraine said I.
Everything is a part of the pattern, my old friend, Moraine replied softly. We cannot pick and choose, but we shall see. Tom put his feet on the stable floor and turned from the ladder, brushing straw from his patch-covered cloak.
In fact, he said in more normal tones, you might say that I insist on traveling in company. I have given many hours over many mugs of ale to thinking of how I might end my days. A Trollocs cookpot was not one of the thoughts. He looked askance at the warder's sword. There's no need for that. I am not a cheese for slicing.
Master Merlin, Moraine said, we must go quickly and almost certainly in great danger. The Trollocs are still out there, and we go by night.
Are you sure that you want to travel with us?
Tom eyed the lot of them with a quizzical smile.
If it is not too dangerous for the girl, it can't be too dangerous for me. Besides, what gleeman would not face a little danger to perform in Tar Valon?
Moraine nodded, and Lan scabbarded his sword. Rand suddenly wondered what would have happened if Tom had changed his mind, or if Moraine had not nodded. The gleeman began saddling his horse as if similar thoughts had never crossed his mind, but Rand noticed that he eyed Lan's sword more than once. Now, Moraine said, what horse for Egwene?
The peddler's horses are as bad as the Durans, the warrior replied sourly. Strong but slow plotters.
Bella, Rand said, getting a look from Lan that made him wish he had kept silent. But he knew he could not dissuade Egwene. The only thing left was to help. Bella may not be as fast as the others, but she's strong. I ride her sometimes. She can keep up. Lan looked into Bella's stall, muttering under his breath.
She might be a little better than the others, he said finally. I don't suppose there is any other choice.
Then she will have to do, Moraine said. Rand, find a saddle for Bella. Quickly now. We have tarried too long already. Rand hurriedly chose a saddle and blanket in the tack room, then fetched Bella from her stall. The mare looked back at him in sleepy surprise when he put the saddle on her back. When he rode her, it was barebacked. She was not used to a saddle. He made soothing noises while he tightened the girth strap, and she accepted the oddity with no more than a shake of her mane. Taking Egwene's bundle from her, he tied it on behind the saddle while she mounted and adjusted her skirts. They were not divided for riding astride, so her wool stockings were bared to the knee. She wore the same soft leather shoes as all the other village girls. They were not at all suited for journeying to Watch Hill, much less Tar Valon. I still think you shouldn't come, he said. I wasn't making it up about the Trollocs, but I promise you I will take care of you. Perhaps I'll take care of you, she replied lightly. At his exasperated look, she smiled and bent down to smooth his hair. I know you'll look after me, Rand. We will look after each other. But now you had better look after getting on your horse. All of the others were already mounted and waiting for him, he realized. The only horse left riderless was Cloud, a tall gray with a black mane and tail that belonged to John Thane, or had. He scrambled into the saddle, though not without difficulty, as the gray tossed his head and pranced sideways as Rand put his foot in the stirrup, and his scabbard caught in his legs. It was not chance that his friends had not chosen Cloud. Master Thane often raced the spirited gray against merchants' horses, and Rand had never known him to lose. But he had never known Cloud to give anyone an easy ride, either. Lan must have given a huge price to make the miller sell. As he settled in the saddle, Cloud's dancing increased, as if the gray were eager to run. Rand gripped the reins firmly and tried to think that he would have no trouble. Perhaps if he convinced himself, he could convince the horse, too. An owl hooted in the night outside, and the village people jumped before they realized what it was. They laughed nervously and exchanged shamefaced looks. Next thing, field mice will chase us up a tree, Egwene said with an unsteady chuckle. Lan shook his head. Better if it had been wolves. Wolves? Perrin exclaimed, and the warder favored him with a flat stare. Wolves don't like Trollocs, Blacksmith, and Trollocs don't like wolves or dogs either. If I heard wolves, I would be sure there were no Trollocs waiting out there for us. He moved into the moonlit night, walking his tall black slowly. Moraine rode after him without a moment's hesitation, and Egwene kept hard to the Aes Sedai's side. Rand and the Gleeman brought up the rear, following Mat and Perrin. The back of the inn was dark and silent, and dappled moon shadows filled the stable yard. The soft thuds of the hooves faded quickly, swallowed by the night. In the darkness, the warder's cloak made him a shadow too. Only the need to let him lead the way kept the others from clustering around him. Getting out of the village without being seen was going to be no easy task, Rand decided as he neared the gate. At least without being seen by villagers. Many windows in the village emitted pale yellow light, and although those glows seemed very small in the night now, shapes moved frequently within them. The shapes of villagers watching to see what this night brought. No one wanted to be caught by surprise again. In the deep shadows beside the inn, just on the point of leaving the stable yard, Lan abruptly halted, motioning sharply for silence. Boots rattled on the wagon bridge, and here and there on the bridge, moonlight glinted off metal. The boots clattered across the bridge, grated on gravel, and approached the inn. No sound at all came from those in the shadow. Rand suspected his friends, at least, were too frightened to make a noise. Like him. The footsteps halted before the inn, and the grayness just beyond the dim light from the common room windows. It was not until John Thane stepped forward, a spear propped on his stout shoulder, an old jerkin, sewn all over with steel discs, straining across his chest, that Rand saw them for what they were. A dozen men from the village and the surrounding farms, some in helmets or pieces of armor that had lain dust-covered in attics for generations, all with a spear or a wood axe or a rusty bill. The miller peered into a common room window, then turned with a curt, "It looks right here." The others formed in two ragged ranks behind him, and the patrol marched into the night as if stepping to three different drums. "Two double Trollocs would have them all for breakfast," Lan muttered when the sound of their boots had faded. "But they have eyes and ears." He turned his stallion back. "Come." Slowly, quietly, the warder took them back across the stable yard, down the bank, through the willows, and into the wine-spring water. So close to the wine-spring itself, the cold, swift water, gleaming as it swirled around the horse's legs, was deep enough to lap against the soles of the riders' boots. Climbing out on the far bank, a line of horses wound its way under the warder's deft direction, keeping away from any of the village houses. From time to time, Lan stopped, signing them all to be quiet, though no one else heard or saw anything. Each time he did, however, another patrol of villagers and farmers soon passed. Slowly they moved toward the north edge of the village. Rand peered at the high-peaked houses in the dark, trying to impress them on his memory. A fine adventurer I am, he thought. He was not even out of the village yet, and already he was homesick. But he did not stop looking. They passed beyond the last farmhouses on the outskirts of the village, and into the countryside, paralleling the north road that led to Tarn Ferry. Rand thought that surely no night sky elsewhere could be as beautiful as the Two Rivers sky. The clear black seemed to reach forever, and myriad stars gleamed like points of light scattered through crystal. The moon, only a thin slice less than full, appeared almost close enough to touch, if he stretched and... A black shape flew slowly across the silvery ball of the moon. Rand's involuntary jerk on the reins halted the gray. A bat, he thought weakly, but he knew it was not. Bats were a common sight of an evening, darting after flies and bite-me's in the twilight. The wings that carried this creature might have the same shape, but they moved with the slow, powerful sweep of a bird of prey. And it was hunting. The way it cast back and forth in the long arcs left no doubt of that. Worst of all was the size. For a bat to seem so large against the moon, it would have had to be almost within arm's reach. He tried to judge in his mind how far away it must be and how big. The body of it had to be as large as a man, and the wings... It crossed the face of the moon again, wheeling suddenly downward to be engulfed by the night. He did not realize that Lan had ridden back to him until the warder caught his arm. "What are you sitting here and staring at, boy? We have to keep moving." The others waited behind Lan. Half expecting to be told he was letting fear of the Trollocs overcome his sense, Rand told what he had seen. He hoped that Lan would dismiss it as a bat or a trick of his eyes. Lan growled a word, sounding as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Drogkar." Egwene and the other Two Rivers folk stared at the sky nervously in all directions, but the Gleeman groaned softly. "Yes," Moraine said. "It is too much to hope otherwise. And if the Myrddraal has a drag car at his command, then he will soon know where we are, if he does not already. We must move more quickly than we can cross-country. We may still reach Taran Ferry ahead of the Myrddraal, and he and his Trollocs will not cross as easily as we. A drug car? Egwene said. What is it? It was Tom Merrilin who answered her hoarsely. In the war that ended the Age of Legends, worse than Trollocs and Halfmen were created. Moraine's head jerked toward him as he spoke. Not even the dark could hide the sharpness of her look. Before anyone could ask the Gleeman for more, Lan began giving directions. We take to the North Road now. For your lives, follow my lead, keep up, and keep together. He wheeled his horse about, and the others galloped wordlessly after him. Chapter 11. The Road to Taran Ferry. On the hard-packed dirt of the North Road, the horses stretched out, manes and tails streaming back in the moonlight as they raced northward, hooves pounding a steady rhythm. Lan led the way, black horse and shadow-clad rider all but invisible in the cold night. Moraine's white mare, matching the stallion stride for stride, was a pale dart speeding through the dark. The rest followed in a tight line, as if they were all tied to a rope with one end in the warder's hands. Rand galloped last in line, with Tom Merrilin just ahead, and the others less distinct beyond. The Gleeman never turned his head, reserving his eyes for where they ran, not what they ran from. If Trollocs appeared behind, or the Fade on its silent horse, or that flying creature, the Drakkar, it would be up to Rand to sound an alarm. Every few minutes he craned his neck to peer behind while he clung to Cloud's mane and reins. The Drakkar, worse than Trollocs and Fades, Tom had said. But the sky was empty, and only darkness and shadows met his eyes on the ground. Shadows that could hide an army. Now that the gray had been let loose to run, the animal sped through the night like a ghost, easily keeping pace with Lan's stallion. And Cloud wanted to go faster. He wanted to catch the black, strained to catch the black. Rand had to keep a firm hand on the reins to hold him back. Cloud lunged against his restraint as if the gray thought this were a race, fighting him for mastery with every stride. Rand clung to saddle and reins with every muscle taut. Fervently he hoped his mount did not detect how uneasy he was. If Cloud did, he would lose the one real edge he held, however precariously. Lying low on Cloud's neck, Rand kept a worried eye on Bella and on her rider. When he had said the shaggy mare could stay with the others, he had not meant on the run. She kept up now only by running as he had not thought she could. Lan had not wanted Egwene in their number. Would he slow for her if Bella began to flag? Or would he try to leave her behind? The Aes Sedai and the warder thought Rand and his friends were important in some way, but for all of Moraine's talk of the pattern, he did not think they included Egwene in that importance. If Bella fell back, he would fall back too, whatever Moraine and Lan had to say about it. Back where the Fade and the Trollocs were. Back where the Drakkar was. With all his heart and desperation, he silently shouted at Bella to run like the wind. Silently tried to will strength into her. Run! His skin prickled, and his bones felt as if they were freezing, ready to split open. The light help her run. And Bella ran. On and on they sped, northward into the night, time fading into an indistinct blur. Now and again the lights of farmhouses flashed into sight, then disappeared as quickly as imagination. Dogs' sharp challenges faded swiftly behind, or cut off abruptly as the dogs decided they had been chased away. They raced through darkness, relieved only by watery pale moonlight. A darkness where trees along the road loomed up without warning, then were gone. For the rest, murk surrounded them, and only a solitary nightbird's cry, lonely and mournful, disturbed the steady pounding of hooves. Abruptly, Lan slowed, then brought the file of horses to a stop. Rand was not sure how long they had been moving, but a soft ache filled his legs from gripping the saddle. Ahead of them in the night, lights sparkled, as if a tall swarm of flies held one place among the trees. Rand frowned at the lights in puzzlement, then suddenly gasped with surprise. The fireflies were windows, the windows of houses covering the sides and top of a hill. It was Watch Hill. He could hardly believe they had come so far. They had probably made the journey as fast as it had ever been traveled. Following Lan's example, Rand and Tom Merrilin dismounted. Cloud stood head down, sides heaving. Lather, almost indistinguishable from the horse's smoky sides, flecked the gray's neck and shoulders. Rand thought that Cloud would not be carrying anyone further that night.
Much as I would like to put all these villages behind me, Tom announced, a few hours' rest would not go amiss right now. Surely we have enough of a lead to allow that.
Rand stretched, knuckling the small of his back. If we're stopping the rest of the night in Watch Hill, we may as well go on up. A vagrant gust of wind brought a fragment of song from the village and smells of cooking that made his mouth water. They were still celebrating in Watch Hill. There had been no Trollocs to disturb their Beltane. He looked for Egwene. She was leaning against Bella, slumped with weariness. The others were climbing down as well, with many a sigh and much stretching of aching muscles. Only the warder and the Aes Sedai showed no visible sign of fatigue. I could do with some singing, Matt put in tiredly, and maybe a hot mutton pie at the White Boar. Pausing, he added, I've never been further than Watch Hill. The White Boar is not nearly as good as the Winespring Inn. The White Boar isn't so bad, Perrin said. A mutton pie for me, too, and lots of hot tea to take the chill off my bones.
We cannot stop until we are across the Tauren, Lan said sharply. Not for more than a few minutes.
But the horses, Rand protested. We'll run them to death if we try to go any further tonight. Moraine Sedai, surely you... He had vaguely noticed her moving among the horses, but he had not paid any real attention to what she did. Now she brushed past him to lay her hands on Cloud's neck. Rand fell silent. Suddenly the horse tossed his head with a soft whicker, nearly pulling the reins from Rand's hands. The gray danced a step sideways, as restive as if he had spent a week in a stable. Without a word, Moraine went to Bella. I did not know she could do that, Rand said softly to Lan, his cheeks hot.
You, of all people, should have suspected it, the warder replied. You watched her with your father. She will wash all the fatigue away, first from the horses, then from the rest of you.
The rest of us? Not you?
Not me, sheepherder. I don't need it, not yet. And not her. What she can do for others, she cannot do for herself. Only one of us will ride tired. You had better hope she does not grow too tired before we reach Tar Valon.
Too tired for what? Rand asked the warder. You are right about your Bella, Rand, Moraine said from where she stood by the mare. She has a good heart, and as much stubbornness as the rest of you Two Rivers folk. Strange as it seems, she may be the least weary of all. A scream ripped the darkness, a sound like a man dying under sharp knives, and wings swooped low above the party. The night deepened in the shadow that swept over them. With panicked cries, the horses reared wildly. The wind of the Drakkar's wings beat at Rand with a feel like the touch of slime, like chittering in the dank dimness of a nightmare. He had no time even to feel the fear of it, for Cloud exploded into the air with a scream of his own, twisting desperately as if attempting to shake off some clinging thing. Rand, hanging onto the reins, was jerked off his feet and dragged across the ground, Cloud screaming as though the big gray felt wolves tearing at his hocks. Somehow he maintained his grip on the reins. Using the other hand, as much as his legs, he scrambled onto his feet, taking leaping, staggering steps to keep from being pulled down again. His breath came in ragged pants of desperation. He could not let Cloud get away. He threw out a frantic hand, barely catching the bridle. Cloud reared, lifting him into the air. Rand clung helplessly, hoping against hope that the horse would quieten. The shock of landing jarred Rand to his teeth, but suddenly the gray was still, nostrils flaring and eyes rolling, stiff-legged and trembling. Rand was trembling as well, and all but hanging from the bridle. That jolt must have shaken the fool animal, too, he thought. He took 3 or 4 deep, shaky breaths. Only then could he look around and see what had happened to the others. Chaos reigned among the party. They clutched reins against jerking heads, trying with little success to calm the rearing horses that dragged them about in a milling mass. Only 2 seemingly had no trouble at all with their mounts. Moraine sat straight in her saddle, the white mare stepping delicately away from the confusion as if nothing at all out of the ordinary had happened. On foot, Lan scanned the sky, sword in one hand and reins in the other. The sleek black stallion stood quietly beside him. Sounds of merrymaking no longer came from Watch Hill. Those in the village must have heard the cry, too. Rand knew they would listen a while, and perhaps watch for what had caused it, then return to their jollity. They would soon forget the incident, its memory submerged by song and food and dance and fun. Perhaps when they heard the news of what had happened in Emond's Field, some would remember and wonder. A fiddle began to play, and after a moment, a flute joined in. The village was resuming its celebration. "Mount," Lan commanded curtly. Sheathing his sword, he leaped onto the stallion. The Drakkar would not have showed itself unless it had already reported our whereabouts to the Myrddraal. Another strident shriek drifted down from far above, fainter but no less harsh. The music from Watch Hill silenced raggedly once more. It tracks us now, marking us for the half-man. He won't be far. The horses, fresh now as well as being fear-struck, pranced and backed away from those trying to mount. A cursing Tom Maryland was the first into his saddle, but the others were up soon after. All but one. "Hurry, Rand!" Egwene shouted. The Drakkar gave shrill voice once more, and Bella ran a few steps before she could rein the mare in. "Hurry!" With a start, Rand realized that instead of trying to mount Cloud, he had been standing there staring at the sky in a vain attempt to locate the source of those vile shrieks. More, all unaware, he had drawn Tam's sword as if to fight the flying thing. His face reddened, making him glad for the night to hide him. Awkwardly, with one hand occupied by the reins, he resheathed the blade, glancing hastily at the others. Moraine, Lan, and Egwene all were looking at him, though he could not be sure how much they could see in the moonlight. The rest seemed too absorbed with keeping their horses under control to pay him any mind. He put a hand on the pommel and reached the saddle in one leap, as if he had been doing the like all his life. If any of his friends had noticed the sword, he would surely hear about it later. There would be time enough to worry about it then. As soon as he was in the saddle, they were all off at a gallop again, up the road and by the dome-like hill. Dogs barked in the village. Their passage was not entirely unnoticed. Or maybe the dogs smelled Trollocs, Rand thought. The barking and the village lights alike vanished quickly behind them. They galloped in a knot, horses all but jostling each other as they ran. Lan ordered them to spread out again, but no one wanted to be even a little alone in the night. A scream came from high overhead. The warder gave up and let them run clustered. Rand was close behind Moraine and Lan, the gray straining in an effort to force himself between the warder's black and the Aes Sedai's trim mare. Egwene and the Gleeman raced on either flank of him, while Rand's friends crowded in behind. Cloud, spurred by the Drakkar's cries, ran beyond anything Rand could do to slow him, even if he had wished to. Yet the gray could not gain so much as a step on the other two horses. The Drakkar's shriek challenged the night. Stout Bella ran with neck outstretched and tail and mane streaming in the wind of her running, matching the larger horses every stride. The Aes Sedai must have done something more than simply ridding her of fatigue. Egwene's face in the moonlight was smiling in excited delight. Her braid streamed behind like the horses' manes, and the gleam in her eyes was not all from the moon, Rand was sure. His mouth dropped open in surprise until a swallowed bite-me set him off into a fit of coughing. Lan must have asked a question, for Moraine suddenly shouted over the wind and the pounding of hooves. "I cannot. Most especially not from the back of a galloping horse. They are not easily killed, even when they can be seen. We must run and hope." They galloped through a tatter of fog, thin and no higher than the horse's knees. Cloud sped through it in 2 strides, and Rand blinked, wondering if he had imagined it. Surely the night was too cold for fog. Another patch of ragged gray whisked by them to one side, larger than the first. It had been growing, as if the mist oozed from the ground. Above them, the Drakkar screamed in rage. Fog enveloped the riders for a brief moment and was gone. Came again, and vanished behind. The icy mist left a chill dampness on Rand's face and hands. Then a wall of pale gray loomed before them, and they were suddenly enshrouded. The thickness of it muffled the sound of their hooves to dullness, and the cries from overhead seemed to come through a wall. Rand could only just make out the shapes of Egwene and Tom Maryland on either side of him. Lan did not slow their pace. "There is still only one place we can be going," he called, his voice sounding hollow and directionless. "Myrddraal are sly," Moraine replied. "I will use its own slyness against it." They galloped on silently. Slaty mist obscured both sky and ground, so that the riders themselves turned to shadow, appeared to float through night clouds. Even the legs of their own horses seemed to have vanished. Rand shifted in his saddle, shrinking away from the icy fog. Knowing that Moraine could do things, even seeing her do them, was one thing. Having those things leave his skin damp was something else again. He realized he was holding his breath, too, and called himself 9 kinds of idiot. He could not ride all the way to Tarn Ferry without breathing. She had used the one power on Tam, and he seemed all right. Still, he had to make himself let that breath go and inhale. The air was heavy, but if colder, it was otherwise no different than that on any other foggy night. He told himself that, but he was not sure he believed it. Lan encouraged them to keep close now, to stay where each could see the outlines of others in that damp, frosty grayness. Yet the water still did not slacken his stallion's dead run. Side by side, Lan and Moraine led the way through the fog as if they could see clearly what lay ahead. The rest could only trust and follow. And hope. The shrill cries that had hounded them faded as they galloped, and then were gone, but that gave small comfort. Forest and farmhouses, moon and road were shrouded and hidden. Dogs still barked, hollow and distant in the gray haze, when they passed farms, but there was no other sound save the dull drumming of their horses' hooves. Nothing in that featureless ashen fog changed. Nothing gave any hint of the passage of time except the growing ache in thigh and back. It had to have been hours, Rand was sure. His hands had clutched his reins until he was not sure he could release them, and he wondered if he would ever walk properly again. He glanced back only once. Shadows in the fog raced behind him, but he could not even be certain of their number, or even that they really were his friends. The chill and damp soaked through his cloak and coat and shirt, soaked into his bones, so it seemed. Only the rush of air past his face and the gather and stretch of the horse beneath him told him he was moving at all. It must have been hours. "Slow," Lan called suddenly. "Draw rein." Rand was so startled that Cloud forced between Lan and Moraine, forging ahead for half a dozen strides before he could pull the big gray to a halt and stare. Houses loomed in the fog on all sides, houses strangely tall to Rand's eye. He had never seen this place before, but he had often heard descriptions. That tallness came from high redstone foundations, necessary when the spring melt in the mountains of mist made the Tarn overflow its banks. They had reached Tarn Ferry. Lan trotted the black warhorse past him. "Don't be so eager, sheepherder." Discomfited, Rand fell into place without explaining as the party moved deeper into the village. His face was hot, and for the moment the fog was welcome. A lone dog, unseen in the cold mist, barked at them furiously, then ran away. Here and there a light appeared in a window as some early risers stirred. Other than the dog, no sound save the muted clops of their horses' hooves disturbed the last hour of the night. Rand had met few people from Tarn Ferry. He tried to recall what little he knew about them. They seldom ventured down into what they called the lower villages, with their noses up as if they smelled something bad. The few he had met bore strange names like Hilltop and Stoneboat. One and all, Tarn Ferry folk had a reputation for slyness and trickery. If you shook hands with a Tarn Ferryman, people said, you counted your fingers afterwards. Lan and Moraine stopped before a tall, dark house that looked exactly like any other in the village. Fog swirled around the warder like smoke as he leaped from his saddle and mounted the stairs that rose to the front door, as high above the street as their heads. At the top of the stairs, Lan hammered with his fist on the door. "I thought he wanted quiet," Matt muttered. Lan's pounding went on. A light appeared in the window of the next house, and someone shouted angrily, but the warder kept on with his drumming. Abruptly, the door was flung back by a man in a nightshirt that flapped about his bare ankles. An oil lamp in one hand illumined a narrow face with pointed features. He opened his mouth angrily, then let it stay open as his head swiveled to take in the fog, eyes bulging. "What's this?" he said. "What's this?" Chill gray tendrils curled into the doorway, and he hurriedly stepped back away from them. "Master Hightower," Lan said. "Just the man I need. We want to cross over on your ferry." He never even saw Hightower, Matt snickered. Rand made shushing motions at his friend. The sharp-faced fellow raised his lamp higher and peered down at them suspiciously. After a minute, Master Hightower said crossly, "The ferry goes over in daylight. Not in the night, not ever. And not in this fog, neither. Come back when the sun's up and the fog's gone." He started to turn away, but Lan caught his wrist. The ferryman opened his mouth angrily. Gold glinted in the lamplight as the warder counted out coins one by one into the other's palm. Hightower licked his lips as the coins clinked, and by inches his head moved closer to his hand, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. "And as much again," Lan said, "when we are safely on the other side. But we leave now." "Now?" Chewing his lower lip, the Faraday man shifted his feet and peered out at the mist-laden night, then nodded abruptly. "Now it is. But let loose my wrist. I have to rouse my haulers. You don't think I pull the ferry across myself, do you?" "I will wait at the ferry," Lan said flatly. "For a little while." He released his hold on the ferryman. Master Hightower jerked the handful of coins to his chest and, nodding agreement, hastily shoved the door closed with his hip. Chapter 12. Across the Tarn. Lan came down the stairs, telling the company to dismount and lead their horses after him through the fog. Again, they had to trust that the warder knew where he was going. The fog swirled around Rand's knees, hiding his feet, obscuring everything more than a yard away. The fog was not as heavy as it had been outside the town, but he could barely make out his companions. Still, no humans stirred in the night except for them. A few more windows than before showed a light, but the thick mist turned most of them to dim patches, and as often as not, that hazy glow hanging in the gray was all that was visible. Other houses, revealing a little more, seemed to float on a sea of cloud, or to thrust abruptly out of the mist while their neighbors remained hidden, so that they could have stood alone for miles around. Rand moved stiffly from the ache of the long ride, wondering if there was any way he could walk the rest of the way to Tar Valon. Not that walking was much better than riding at that moment, of course, but even so, his feet were almost the only part of him that was not sore. At least he was used to walking. Only once did anyone speak loudly enough for Rand to hear clearly. "You must handle it," Moraine said in answer to something unheard from Lan. "He will remember too much as it is, and no help for it. If I stand out in his thoughts..." Rand grumpily shifted his now sodden cloak on his shoulders, keeping close with the others. Matt and Perrin grumbled to themselves, muttering under their breaths, with bitten-off exclamations whenever one stubbed a toe on something unseen. Tom Merrilin grumbled too, words like hot meal and fire and mulled wine reaching Rand. But neither the warder nor the Aes Sedai took notice. Egwene marched along without a word, her back straight, her head high. It was a somewhat painfully hesitant march, to be sure, for she was as unused to riding as the rest. She was getting her adventure, he thought glumly, and as long as it lasted, he doubted if she would notice little things like fog or damp or cold. There must be a difference in what you saw, it seemed to him, depending on whether you sought adventure or had it forced on you. The stories could no doubt make galloping through a cold fog with a Drakkar, and the light alone knew what else chasing you, sound thrilling. Egwene might be feeling a thrill. He only felt cold and damp and glad to have a village around him again, even if it was Tarn Ferry. Abruptly, he walked into something large and warm in the murk. Lan's stallion. The warder and Moraine had stopped, and the rest of the party did the same, patting their mounts as much to comfort themselves as the animals. The fog was a little thinner here, enough for them to see one another more clearly than they had in a long while, but not enough to make out much more. Their feet were still hidden by low billows like gray floodwater. The houses seemed to have all been swallowed. Cautiously, Rand let Cloud forward a little way, and was surprised to hear his boots scrape on wooden planks. The ferry landing. He backed up carefully, making the grayback as well. He had heard what the Tarn ferry landing was like, a bridge that led nowhere except to the ferry boat. The Tarn was supposed to be wide and deep, with treacherous currents that could pull under the strongest swimmer. Much wider than the wine spring water, he supposed. With the fog added in, it was a relief when he felt dirt under his feet again. A fierce hiss ran, as sharp as the fog. The warder brushed at them as he dashed to Perrin's side and threw back the stocky youth's cloak, exposing the great axe. Obediently, if still not understanding, Rand tossed his own cloak over his shoulder to show his sword. As Lan moved swiftly back to his horse, bobbing lights appeared in the mist, and muffled footsteps approached. 6 stolid-faced men in rough clothes followed Master Hightower. The torches they carried burned away a patch of fog around them. When they stopped, all of the party from Emond's Field could be plainly seen, the lot of them surrounded by a gray wall that seemed thicker for the torchlight reflected from it. The ferryman examined them, his narrow head tilted, nose twitching like a weasel, sniffing the breeze for a trap. Lan leaned against his saddle with apparent casualness, but one hand rested ostentatiously on the long hilt of his sword. There was an air about him of a metal spring, compressed, waiting. Rand hurriedly copied the warder's pose, at least insofar as putting his hand on his sword. He did not think he could achieve that deadly-seeming slouch. They'd probably laugh if I tried. Perrin eased his axe in its leather loop and planted his feet deliberately. Matt put a hand to his quiver, though Rand was not sure what condition his bowstring was in after being out in all this damp. Tom Merrilin stepped forward grandly and held up one empty hand, turning it slowly. Suddenly he gestured with a flourish, and a dagger twirled between his fingers. The hilt slapped into his palm, and, abruptly nonchalant, he began trimming his fingernails. A low, delighted laugh floated from Moraine. Egwene clapped as if watching a performance at festival, then stopped and looked abashed, though her mouth twitched with a smile just the same. Hightower seemed far from amused. He stared at Tom, then cleared his throat loudly. "There was mention of more gold for the crossing." He looked around at them again, a sullen, sly look. "What you gave me before is in a safe place now, here. It's none of it where you can get at it." "The rest of the gold," Lan told him, "goes into your hand when we are on the other side." The leather purse hanging at his waist clinked as he gave it a little shake. For a moment the ferryman's eyes darted, but at last he nodded. "Let's be about it, then," he muttered, and stalked out onto the landing, followed by his 6 helpers. The fog burned away around them as they moved. Gray tendrils closed in behind, quickly filling where they had been. Rand hurried to keep up. The ferry itself was a wooden barge with high sides, bordered by a ramp that could be raised to block off the end. Ropes as thick as a man's wrist ran along each side of it, ropes fastened to massive posts at the end of the landing and disappearing into the night over the river. The ferryman's helpers stuck their torches in iron brackets on the ferry's sides, waited while everyone led their horses aboard, then pulled up the ramp. The deck creaked beneath hooves and shuffling feet, and the ferry shifted with the weight. Hightower muttered half under his breath, growling for them to keep the horses still and stay to the center, out of the hauler's way. He shouted at his helpers, chivying them as they readied the ferry to cross, but the men moved at the same reluctant speed, whatever he said, and he was half-hearted about it, often cutting off in mid-shout to hold his torch high and peer into the fog. Finally, he stopped shouting altogether and went to the bow, where he stood staring into the mist that covered the river. He did not move until one of the haulers touched his arm. Then he jumped, glaring. "What? Oh, you, is it? Ready? About time. Well, man, what are you waiting for?" He waved his arms, heedless of the torch, and the way the horses whickered, and tried to move back. "Cast off! Give way! Move!" The man slouched off to comply, and Hightower peered once more into the fog ahead, rubbing his free hand uneasily on his coat front. The ferry lurched as its moorings were loosed, and the strong current caught it, then lurched again as the guide ropes held it. The haulers, 3 to a side, grabbed hold of the ropes at the front of the ferry and laboriously began walking toward the back, muttering uneasily as they edged out onto the gray-cloaked river. The landing disappeared as mist surrounded them, tenuous streamers drifting across the ferry between the flickering torches. The barge rocked slowly in the current. Nothing except the steady tread of the haulers, forward to take hold of the ropes and back down again, pulling, gave a hint of any other movement. No one spoke. The villagers kept as close to the center of the ferry as they could. They had heard the Tarn was far wider than the streams they were used to. The fog made it infinitely vaster in their minds. After a time, Rand moved closer to Lan. Rivers a man could not wade or swim or even see across were nervous-making to someone who had never seen anything broader or deeper than a waterwood pond. "Would they really have tried to rob us?" he asked quietly. He acted more as if he were afraid we would rob him. The warder eyed the ferryman and his helpers. None appeared to be listening, before answering just as softly. "With the fog to hide them, well, when what they do is hidden, men sometimes deal with strangers in ways they wouldn't if there were other eyes to see. And the quickest to harm a stranger are the soonest to think a stranger will harm them. This fellow, I believe he might sell his mother to Trollocs for stew meat if the price was right. I'm a little surprised you asked. I heard the way people in Emmons Field speak of those from Tarn Ferry." "Yes, but, well, everyone says they... But I never thought they would actually..." Rand decided he had better stop thinking that he knew anything at all of what people were like beyond his own village. "He might tell the Fade we crossed on the ferry," he said at last. "Maybe he'll bring the Trollocs over after us." Lan chuckled dryly. "Robbing a stranger is one thing. Dealing with a half-man, something else again. Can you really see him ferrying Trollocs over, especially in this fog, no matter how much gold was offered? Or even talking to a Murdral, if he had any choice? Just the thought of it would keep him running for a month. I don't think we have to worry very much about dark friends in Tarn Ferry. Not here. We are safe, for a time at least. From this lot, anyway. Watch yourself." Hightower had turned from peering into the fog ahead. Pointed face pushed forward and torch held high, he stared at Lan and Rand as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Deck planks creaked under the hauler's feet and the occasional stamp of a hoof. Abruptly, the ferryman twitched as he realized they were watching him, watching them. With a leap, he spun back to looking for the far bank, or whatever it was he sought in the fog. "Say no more," Lan said, so softly, Rand almost could not understand. "These are bad days to speak of Trollocs or dark friends, or the father of lies with strange ears to hear. Such talk can bring worse than the dragon's fang scrawled on your door." Rand felt no desire to go on with his questions. Gloom settled on him even more than it had before. Dark friends? As if Thades and Trollocs and Drakkar were not enough to worry about. At least you could tell a Trolloc at sight. Abruptly, pilings loomed shadowy in the mist before them. The ferry thudded against the far bank, and then the haulers were hurrying to lash the craft fast and let down the ramp at that end with a thump, while Mat and Perrin announced loudly that the Tarn was not half as wide as they had heard. Lan led his stallion down the ramp, followed by Moraine and the others. As Rand, the last, took Cloud down behind Bella, Master Hightower called out angrily, "Here now! Here! Where's my gold?" "It shall be paid," Moraine's voice came from somewhere in the mist. Rand's boots clumped from the ramp to a wooden landing. "And a silver mark for each of your men," the Aes Sedai added, "for the quick crossing." The ferryman hesitated, a face pushed forward as if he smelled danger. But at the mention of silver, the haulers roused themselves. Some paused to seize a torch, but they all thumped down the ramp before Hightower could open his mouth. With a sullen grimace, the ferryman followed his crew. Cloud's hooves clumped hollowly in the fog as Rand made his way carefully along the landing. The gray mist was as thick here as over the river. At the foot of the landing, the warder was handing out coins, surrounded by the torches of Hightower and his fellows. Everyone else except Moraine waited just beyond in an anxious cluster. The Aes Sedai stood looking at the river, though what she could see was beyond Rand. With a shiver, he hitched up his cloak, sodden as it was. He was really out of two rivers now, and it seemed much farther away than the width of a river. "There," Lan said, handing a last coin to Hightower, as agreed. He did not put up his purse, and the ferrety-faced man eyed it greedily. With a loud creak, the landing shivered. Hightower jerked upright, head swiveling back toward the mist-cloaked ferry. The torches remaining on board were a pair of dim, fuzzy points of light. The landing groaned, and with a thunderous crack of snapping wood, the twin glows lurched, then began to revolve. Egwene cried out wordlessly, and Tom cursed. "It's loose!" Hightower screamed. Grabbing his haulers, he pushed them toward the end of the landing. "The ferry's loose, you fools! Get it! Get it!" The haulers stumbled a few steps under Hightower's shoves, then stopped. The faint lights on the ferry spun faster, then faster still. The fog above them swirled, sucked into a spiral. The landing trembled. The cracking and splintering of wood filled the air as the ferry began breaking apart. "Whirlpool," one of the haulers said, his voice filled with awe. "No whirlpools on the Tarn." Hightower sounded empty. "Never been a whirlpool." "An unfortunate occurrence." Moraine's voice was hollow in the fog that made her a shadow as she turned from the river. "Unfortunate," Lan agreed in a flat tone. "It seems you'll be carrying no one else across the river for a time. An ill thing that you lost your craft in our service." He delved again into his purse, ready in his hand. "This should repay you." For a moment, Hightower stared at the gold, glinting in Lan's hand in the torchlight. Then his shoulders hunched and his eyes darted to the others he had carried across. Made indistinct by the fog, the Emmons fielders stood silently. With a frightened, inarticulate cry, the ferryman snatched the coins from Lan, whirled, and ran into the mist. His haulers were only half a step behind him, their torches quickly swallowed as they vanished upriver. "There is nothing further to hold us here," the Aes Sedai said, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Leading her white mare, she started away from the landing, up the bank. Rand stood staring at the hidden river. It could have been happenstance. No whirlpools, he said, but it... Abruptly, he realized everyone else had gone. Hurriedly, he scrambled up the gently sloping bank. In the space of 3 paces, the heavy mist faded away to nothing. He stopped dead and stared back. Along a line running down the shore, thick gray hung on one side. On the other shone a clear night sky, still dark, though the sharpness of the moon hinted at dawn not far off. The warder and the Aes Sedai stood conferring beside their horses a short distance beyond the border of the fog. The others huddled a little apart. Even in the moonlit darkness, their nervousness was palpable. All eyes were on Lan and Moraine, and all but Egwene were leaning back as if torn between losing the pair and getting too close. Rand trotted the last few spans to Egwene's side, leading Cloud, and she grinned at him. He did not think the shine in her eyes was all from moonlight. "It follows the river as if drawn with a pen," Moraine was saying in satisfied tones. "There are not 10 women in Tar Valon who could do that unaided, not to mention from the back of a galloping horse." "I don't mean to complain, Moraine Sedai," Tom said, sounding oddly diffident for him. "But would it not have been better to cover us a little further? Say to Baerlon. If that Drakkar looks on this side of the river, we'll lose everything we have gained." "Drakkar are not very smart, Master Merlin," the Aes Sedai said dryly. "Fearsome and deadly dangerous, and with sharp eyes, but little intelligence. It will tell the Myrddraal that this side of the river is clear, but the river itself is choked for miles in both directions. The Myrddraal will know the extra effort that cost me. He will have to consider that we may be escaping down the river, and that will slow him. He will have to divide his efforts. The fog should hold long enough that he will never be sure that we did not travel at least partway by boat. I could have extended the fog a little way toward Baerlon instead, but then the Drakkar could search the river in a matter of hours, and the Myrddraal would know exactly where we were headed." Tom made a puffing sound and shook his head. "I apologize, Aes Sedai. I hope I did not offend." Moi, Aes Sedai." Matt stopped to swallow audibly. "The ferry, did you... I don't understand why..." He trailed off weakly, and there was a silence so deep that the loudest sound Rand heard was his own breathing. Finally, Moraine spoke, and her voice filled the empty silence with sharpness. "You all want explanations, but if I explained my every action to you, I would have no time for anything else." In the moonlight, the Aes Sedai seemed taller, somehow, almost looming over them. "Know this. I intend to see you safely to Tar Valon. That is the one thing you need to know." "If we keep standing here," Lan put in, "the Drakkar will not need to search the river. If I remember correctly..." He led his horse on up the riverbank. As if the warder's movement had loosened something in his chest, Rand drew a deep breath. He heard others doing the same, even Tom, and remembered an old saying. Better to spit in a wolf's eye than to cross an Aes Sedai. Its tension had lessened. Moraine was not looming over anyone. She barely reached his chest. "I don't suppose we could rest a bit," Perrin said hopefully, ending with a yawn. Egwene slumped against Bella, sighed tiredly. It was the first sound even approaching a complaint that Rand had heard from her. Maybe now she realizes this isn't some grand adventure after all. Then he guiltily remembered that, unlike him, she had not slept the day away. "We do need to rest, Moraine Sedai," he said. "After all, we have ridden all night." "Then I suggest we see what Lan has for us," Moraine said. "Come." She led them on up the bank into the woods beyond the river. Bare branches thickened the shadows. A good 100 spans from the tarn, they came to a dark mound beside a clearing. Here, a long-ago flood had undermined and toppled an entire stand of leather leaves, washing them together into a great thick tangle, an apparently solid mass of trunks and branches and roots. Moraine stopped, and suddenly a light appeared low to the ground, coming from under the heap of trees. Thrusting a stub of torch ahead of him, Lan crawled out from under the mound and straightened. "No unwelcome visitors," he told Moraine. "And the wood I left is still dry, so I started a small fire. We will rest warm." "You expected us to stop here?" Egwene said in surprise. "It seemed a likely place," Lan replied. "I like to be prepared, just in case." Moraine took the torch from him. "Will you see to the horses? When you are done, I will do what I can about everyone's tiredness. Right now I want to talk to Egwene." "Egwene?" Rand watched the two women crouch down and disappear under the great pile of tree trunks. There was a low opening, barely big enough to crawl into. The light of the torch vanished. Lan had included feed bags and a small quantity of oats in the supplies, But he stopped the others from unsaddling their horses. Instead, he produced the hobbles he had also packed. They would rest easier without the saddles, but if we must leave quickly, there may be no time to replace them. They don't look to me like they need any rest, Perrin said as he attempted to slip a feed bag over his mount's muzzle. The horse tossed its head before allowing him to put the straps in place. Rand was having difficulties with Cloud, too, taking 3 tries before he could get the canvas bag over the gray's nose. They do, Rand told them. He straightened from hobbling his stallion. Oh, they can still run. They will run at their fastest if we let them. Right up to the second they dropped dead from exhaustion they never even felt. It would rather Moraine Sedai had not had to do what she did, but it was necessary. He patted the stallion's neck, and the horse bobbed his head as if acknowledging the warder's touch. We must go slowly with them for the next few days until they recover. More slowly than I would like. But with luck, it will be enough. Is that... Matt swallowed audibly. Is that what she meant? About our tiredness? Rand patted Cloud's neck and stared at nothing. Despite what she had done for Tam, he had no desire for the Aes Sedai to use the power on him. Light. She as much as admitted sinking the ferry. Something like it, Rand chuckled wryly. But you will not have to worry about running yourself to death, not unless things get a lot worse than they are. Just think of it as an extra night's sleep. The shrill scream of the Drakkar suddenly echoed from above the fog-covered river. Even the horses froze. Again it came, closer now, and again, piercing Rand's skull like needles. Then the cries were fading until they had faded away entirely. Luck, Rand breathed. It searches the river for us. He gave a quick shrug and abruptly sounded matter-of-fact. Let's get inside. I could do with some hot tea and something to fill my belly. Rand was the first to crawl on hands and knees through the opening in the tangle of trees and down a short tunnel. At the end of it, he stopped, still crouching. Ahead was an irregularly shaped space, a woody cave easily large enough to hold them all. The roof of tree trunks and branches came too low to allow any but the women to stand. Smoke from a small fire on a bed of river stones drifted up and through. The draft was enough to keep the space free of smoke, but the interweaving was too thick to let out even a glimmer of the flames. Moraine and Egwene, their cloaks thrown aside, sat cross-legged facing one another beside the fire. The one power, Moraine was saying, comes from the true source, the driving force of creation, the force the Creator made to turn the wheel of time. She put her hands together in front of her and pushed them against each other. saidin, the male half of the true source, and saidar, the female half, work against each other and at the same time together to provide that force. saidin, she lifted one hand, then let it drop, is fouled by the touch of the Dark One, like water with a thin slick of rancid oil floating on top. The water is still pure, but it cannot be touched without touching the foulness. Only saidar is still safe to be used. Egwene's back was to Rand. He could not see her face, but she was leaning forward eagerly. Matt poked Rand from behind and muttered something, and he moved on into the tree cavern. Moraine and Egwene ignored his entry. The other men crowded in behind him, tossing off damp cloaks, settling around the fire and holding hands out to the warmth. Lan, the last to enter, pulled water bags and leather sacks from a nook in the wall, took out a kettle, and began to prepare tea. He paid no attention to what the women were saying, but Rand's friends began to stop toasting their hands and stare openly. Tom pretended that all of his interest was engaged in loading his thickly carved pipe, but the way he leaned toward the women gave him away. Moraine and Egwene acted as if they were alone. No, Moraine said in answer to a question Rand had missed. The true source cannot be used up any more than the river can be used up by the wheel of a mill. The source is the river. The Aes Sedai, the water wheel. And you really think I can learn? Egwene asked. Her face shone with eagerness. Rand had never seen her look so beautiful or so far away from him. I can become an Aes Sedai. Rand jumped up, cracking his head against the low roof of logs. Tom Merrilin grabbed his arm, yanking him back down. Don't be a fool, the Gleeman murmured. He eyed the women, neither seemed to have noticed, and the look he gave Rand was sympathetic. It's beyond you now, boy. Child, Moraine said gently. Only a very few can learn to touch the true source and use the one power. Some of those can learn to a greater degree, some to a lesser. You are one of the bare handful for whom there is no need to learn. At least, touching the source will come to you whether you want it or not. Without the teaching you can receive in Tar Valon, though, you will never learn to channel it fully, and you may not survive. Men who have the ability to touch saidin born in them die, of course. And if the Red Aja does not find them and gentle them... Tom growled deep in his throat, and Rand shifted uncomfortably. Men like those of whom the Aes Sedai spoke were rare. He had only heard of 3 in his whole life, and thank the light, never in the Two Rivers. But the damage they did before the Aes Sedai found them was always bad enough for the news to carry, like the news of wars or earthquakes that destroyed cities. He had never really understood what the Ajas did. According to the stories, there were societies among the Aes Sedai that seemed to plot and squabble among themselves more than anything else. But the stories were clear on one point. The Red Aja held its prime duty to be the prevention of another breaking of the world, and they did it by hunting down every man who even dreamed of wielding the one power. Matt and Perrin looked as if they suddenly wished they were back home in their beds. But some of the women die too. It is hard to learn without a guide. The women we do not find, those who live, often become... Well, in this part of the world, they might become wisdoms of their villages. The Aes Sedai paused thoughtfully. The old blood is strong in Emmonsfield, and the old blood sings. I knew you for what you were the moment I saw you. No Aes Sedai can stand in the presence of a woman who can channel, or who is close to her change and not feel it. She rummaged in the pouch at her belt and produced a small blue gem on a gold chain that she had earlier worn in her hair. You are very close to your change, your first touching. It will be better if I guide you through it. That way you will avoid the unpleasant effects that come to those who must find their own way. Egwene's eyes widened as she looked at the stone, and she wet her lips repeatedly. Does that have the power? Of course not, Moraine snapped. Things do not have the power, child. Even an Angreal is only a tool. This is just a pretty blue stone. But it can give off light. Here. Egwene's hands trembled as Moraine laid the stone on her fingertips. She started to pull back, but the Aes Sedai held both her hands in one of hers and gently touched the other to the side of Egwene's head. Look at the stone, the Aes Sedai said softly. It is better this way than fumbling alone. Clear your mind of everything but the stone. Clear your mind and let yourself drift. There is only the stone and emptiness. I will begin it. Drift and let me guide you. No thought. Drift. Rand's fingers dug into his knees. His jaws clenched until they hurt. She has to fail. She has to. Light bloomed in the stone. Just one flash of blue, and then gone. No brighter than a firefly, but he flinched as if it had been blinding. Egwene and Moraine stared into the stone, faces empty. Another flash came, and another, until the azure light pulsed like the beating of a heart. It's the Aes Sedai, he thought, desperately. Moraine's doing it, not Egwene. One last feeble flicker, and the stone was merely a bauble again. Rand held his breath. For a moment, Egwene continued to stare at the small stone. Then she looked up at Moraine. I thought I felt something, but perhaps you're mistaken about me. I am sorry I wasted your time. I have wasted nothing, child. A small smile of satisfaction flitted across Moraine's lips. That last light was yours alone. It was? Egwene exclaimed, then slid immediately back into glumness. But it was barely there at all. Now you are behaving like a foolish village girl. Most who come to Tar Valon must study for many months before they can do what you just did. You may go far, perhaps even the Amaryllis feat one day, if you study hard and work hard. You mean... With a cry of delight, Egwene threw her arms around the Aes Sedai. Oh, thank you. Rand, did you hear? I'm going to be an Aes Sedai. Chapter 13. Choices. Before they went to sleep, Moraine knelt by each in turn and laid her hands on their heads. Lan grumbled that he had no need, as he should not waste his strength, But he did not try to stop her. Egwene was eager for the experience, Matt and Perrin clearly frightened of it, and frightened to say no. Tom jerked away from the Aes Sedai's hands, but she seized his gray head with a look that allowed no nonsense. The Gleeman scowled through the entire thing. She smiled mockingly once she took her hands away. His frown deepened, but he did look refreshed. They all did. Rand had drawn back into a niche in the uneven wall where he hoped he would be overlooked. His eyes wanted to slide closed once he leaned back against the timber jumble, but he forced himself to watch. He pushed a fist against his mouth to stifle a yawn. A little sleep, an hour or two, and he would be just fine. Moraine did not forget him, though. He flinched at the coolness of her fingers on his face and said, "I don't—" His eyes widened in wonder. Tiredness drained out of him like water running downhill. Aches and soreness ebbed to dim memories and vanished. He stared at her with his mouth hanging open. She only smiled and withdrew her hand. "It is done," she said, and as she stood with a weary sigh, he was reminded that she could not do the same for herself. Indeed, she only drank a little tea, refusing the bread and cheese Lan tried to press on her, before curling up beside the fire. She seemed to fall asleep the instant she wrapped her cloak around her. The others, all save Lan, were dropping asleep wherever they could find a space to stretch out, but Rand could not imagine why. He felt as if he had already had a full night in a good bed. No sooner did he lean back against the log wall, though, than sleep rolled him under. When Lan poked him awake an hour later, he felt as though he had had 3 days' rest. The warder awakened them all, except Moraine, and he sternly hushed any sound that might disturb her. Even so, he allowed them only a short stay in the snug cave of trees. Before the sun was twice its own height above the horizon, all traces that anyone had ever stopped there had been cleared away, and they were all mounted and moving north toward Baerlont, riding slowly to conserve the horses. The Aes Sedai's eyes were shadowed, but she sat her saddle upright and steady. Fog still hung thick over the river behind them, a gray wall resisting the efforts of the feeble sun to burn it away and hiding the two rivers from view. Rand watched over his shoulder as he rode, hoping for one last glimpse, even of Tarn Ferry, until the fog bank was lost to sight. "I never thought I'd ever be this far from home," he said when the trees at last hid both the fog and the river. "Remember when Watch Hill seemed a long way? 2 days ago, that was. It seems like forever." "In a month or two, we'll be back," Perrin said in a strained voice. "Think what we'll have to tell." "Even Trollocs can't chase us forever," Matt said. "Burn me, they can't." He straightened around with a heavy sigh, slumping in his saddle as if he did not believe a word that had been said. "Man," Egwene snorted. "You get the adventure you're always prating about, and already you're talking about home." She held her head high, yet Rand noticed a tremor to her voice, now that nothing more was to be seen of the two rivers. Neither Moraine nor Lan made any attempt to reassure them, not a word to say that of course they would come back. He tried not to think on what that might mean. Even rested, he was full enough of doubts without searching for more. Hunching in his saddle, he began a waking dream of tending the sheep alongside Tam in a pasture with deep lush grass and larks singing of a spring morning. And a trip into Emmons Field and Beltane the way it had been, dancing on the green, with never a care beyond whether he might stumble in the steps. He managed to lose himself in it for a long time. The journey to Baerlon took almost a week. Lan muttered about the laggardness of their travel, but it was he who set the pace and forced the rest to keep it. With himself and his stallion Mondarb, he said it meant blade in the old tongue, he was not so sparing. The warder covered twice as much ground as they did, galloping ahead, his color-shifting cloak swirling in the wind to scout what lay before them, or dropping behind to examine their back trail. Any others who tried to move at more than a walk, though, got cutting words on taking care of their animals, biting words on how well they would do afoot if the Trollocs did appear. Not even Moraine was proof against his tongue if she let the white mare pick up her step. Aldib, the mare was called, and the old tongue West Wind, the wind that brought the spring rains. The warder's scouting never turned up any sign of pursuit or ambush. He spoke only to Moraine of what he saw, and that quietly, so it could not be overheard. And the Aes Sedai informed the rest of them of what she thought they needed to know. In the beginning, Rand looked over his shoulder as much as he did ahead. He was not the only one. Perrin fingered his axe often, and Matt rode with an arrow knocked to his bow in the beginning. But the land behind remained empty of Trollocs or figures in black cloaks. The sky remained empty of Drakkar. Slowly, Rand began to think perhaps they really had escaped. No very great cover was to be had, even in the thickest parts of the woods. Winter clung as hard north of the Tarn as it did to the two rivers. Stands of pine or fir or leather leaf, and here and there a few spicewoods or laurels dotted a forest of otherwise bare gray branches. Not even the elders showed a leaf. Only scattered green sprigs of new growth stood out against brown meadows beaten flat by the winter's snows. Here, too, much of what did grow was stinging nettles and coarse thistle and stinkweed. On the bare dirt of the forest floor, some of the last snow still hung on, in shady patches and in drifts beneath the low branches of evergreens. Everyone kept their cloaks drawn well about them, for the thin sunlight had no warmth to it, and the night cold pierced deep. No more birds flew here than in the two rivers, not even ravens. There was nothing leisurely about the slowness of their movement. The North Road, Rand continued to think of it that way, though he suspected it might have a different name here, north of the torrent, still ran almost due north, but at Land's insistence their path snaked this way and that through the forest as often as it ran along the hard-packed dirt road. A village or a farm or any sign of men or civilization sent them circling for miles to avoid it, though there were few enough of any of those. The whole first day Rand saw no evidence aside from the road that men had ever been in that woods. It came to him that even had he gone to the foot of the Mountains of Mist, he might not have been as far from a human habitation as he was that day. The first farm he saw, a large frame house and tall barn with high-peaked thatched roofs, a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney, was a shock. "It's no different from back home," Perrin said, frowning at the distant buildings, barely visible through the trees. People moved around the farmyard, as yet unaware of the travelers. "Of course it is," Matt said. "We're just not close enough to see." "I tell you it's no different," Perrin insisted. "It must be. We're north of the Tarn, after all." "Quiet, you two," Land growled. "We don't want to be seen, remember? This way." He turned west to circle the farm through the trees. Looking back, Rand thought Perrin was right. The farm looked much the same as any around Emmons Field. There was a small boy toting water from the well, and older boys tending sheep behind a rail fence. It even had a curing shed for tobacco. But Matt was right, too. We're north of the torrent. It must be different. Always they halted while light still clung to the sky, to choose a spot sloped for drainage and sheltered from the wind that seldom died completely, only changed direction. Their fire was always small and hidden from only a few yards off, and once tea was brewed, the flames were doused and the coals buried. At their first stop before the sun sank, Land began teaching the boys what to do with the weapons they carried. He started with the bow. After watching Matt put 3 arrows into a knot the size of a man's head on the fissured trunk of a dead leather leaf at 100 paces, he told the others to take their turns. Perrin duplicated Matt's feat, and Rand, summoning the flame in the void, the empty calm that let the bow become a part of him, or him of it, clustered his 3 where the points almost touched one another. Matt gave him a congratulatory clap on the shoulder. "Now if you all had bows," the warder said dryly when they started grinning, "and if the Trollocs agreed not to come so close you couldn't use them." The grin faded abruptly. "Let me see what I can teach you in case they do come that close." He showed Perrin a bit of how to use that great bladed axe. Raising an axe to someone, or something, that had a weapon was not at all like chopping wood or flailing around in pretend. Setting the big apprentice blacksmith to a series of exercises, block, parry, and strike, he did the same for Rand and his sword. Not the wild leaping about and slashing that Rand had in mind whenever he thought about using it, but smooth motions, one flowing into another, almost a dance. "Moving the blade is not enough," Land said, "though some think it is. The mind is part of it, most of it. Blank your mind, sheepherder. Empty it of hate or fear, of everything. Burn them away. You others listen to this, too. You can use it with the axe or the bow, with a spear or a quarterstaff, or even your bare hands." Rand stared at him. "The flame in the void," he said wonderingly. "That's what you mean, isn't it? My father taught me about that." The warder gave him an unreadable look in return. "Hold the sword as I showed you, sheepherder. I cannot make a mud-footed villager into a blade master in an hour, but perhaps I can keep you from slicing off your own foot." Rand sighed and held the sword upright before him in both hands. Moraine watched without expression, but the next evening she told Lan to continue the lessons. The meal at evening was always the same as at midday and breakfast. Flat bread and cheese and dried meat, except that evenings they had hot tea to wash it down instead of water. Tom entertained them evenings. Lan would not let the Gleeman play harp or flute. No need to rouse the countryside, the warder said. But Tom juggled and told stories. Mara and the Three Foolish Kings, or one of the hundreds about Anla, the wise counselor, or something filled with glory and adventure, like The Great Hunt of the Horn, but always with a happy ending and a joyous homecoming. Yet if the land was peaceful around them, if no Trollocs appeared among the trees, no Drakkar among the clouds, it seemed to Rand that they managed to raise their tension themselves, whenever it was in danger of vanishing. There was the morning that Egwene awoke and began unbraiding her hair. Rand watched her from the corner of his eye as he made up his blanket roll. Every night, when the fire was doused, everyone took to their blankets except for Egwene and the Aes Sedai. The two women always went aside from the others and talked for an hour or two, returning when the others were asleep. Egwene combed her hair out, 100 strokes, he counted, while he was saddling Cloud, tying his saddlebags and blanket behind the saddle. Then she tucked the comb away, swept her loose hair over her shoulder, and pulled up the hood of her cloak. Startled, he asked, "What are you doing?" She gave him a sidelong look without answering. It was the first time he had spoken to her in 2 days, he realized, since the night in the log shelter on the bank of the Tarn. But he did not let that stop him. "All your life you wanted to wear your hair in a braid, and now you're giving it up? Why? Because she doesn't braid hers?" "Aes Sedai don't braid their hair," she said simply. "At least, not unless they want to. You aren't an Aes Sedai. You're Egwene Alvear from Emond's Field, and the Women's Circle will have a fit if they could see you now." "Women's Circle business is none of yours, Randolph Thor. And I will be an Aes Sedai, just as soon as I reach Tar Valon." He snorted. "As soon as you reach Tar Valon? Why, Light, tell me that. You're no dark friend." "Do you think Moraine Sedai is a dark friend? Do you?" She squared around to face him with her fists clenched, and he almost thought she was going to hit him. "After she saved the village? After she saved your father?" "I don't know what she is, but whatever she is, it doesn't say anything about the rest of them. The stories—" "Grow up, Rand. Forget the stories and use your eyes." "My eyes saw her sink the ferry. Deny that. Once you get an idea in your head, you won't budge even if somebody points out you're trying to stand on water. If you're such a light-blinded fool, you'd see—" "Fool, am I? Let me tell you a thing or two, Randolph Thor. You are the muleyest, most bull-headed—" "You two trying to wake everybody inside 10 miles?" the warder asked. Standing there with his mouth open, trying to get a word in edgewise, Rand suddenly realized he had been shouting. They both had. Egwene's face went scarlet to her eyebrows, and she spun away with a muttered, "Men." That seemed as much for the warder as for him. Warily, Rand looked around the camp. Everybody was looking at him, not just the warder. Mat and Perrin with their faces white. Tom tensed as if ready to run or fight. Moraine. The Aes Sedai's face was expressionless, but her eyes seemed to bore into his head. Desperately, he tried to recall exactly what he had said about Aes Sedai and dark friends. "It is time to be going," Moraine said. She turned to Aldib, and Rand shivered as if he had been let out of a trap. He wondered if he had been. 2 nights later, with the fire burning low, Mat kicked the last crumbs of cheese from his fingers and said, "You know, I think we've lost them for good." Lan was off in the night, taking a last look around. Moraine and Egwene had gone aside for one of their conversations. Tom was half dozing over his pipe, and the young men had the fire to themselves. Perrin, idly poking the embers with a stick, answered, "If we've lost them, why does Lan keep scouting?" Nearly asleep, Rand rolled over, his back to the fire. "We lost them back at Tarn Ferry." Mat lay back with his fingers laced behind his head, staring at the moon-filled sky. "If they were even really after us." "You think that Drakkar was chasing us because it liked us?" Perrin asked. "I say stop worrying about Trollocs and such," Mat went on, as if Perrin had not spoken, "and start thinking about seeing the world. We're out where the stories come from. What do you think a real city is like?" "We're going to Baerlon," Rand said sleepily, but Mat snorted. "Baerlon's all very well, but I've seen that old map Master Alvear has. If we turn south once we reach Caemlyn, The road leads all the way to Ilion and beyond. What's so special about Ilion? Perrin said, yawning. For one thing, Matt replied, Ilion isn't full of ice. A silence fell, and Rand was suddenly wide awake. Moraine had come back early. Egwene was with her, but it was the Aes Sedai standing at the edge of the firelight who held their attention. Matt lay there on his back, his mouth still open, staring at her. Moraine's eyes caught the light like dark, polished stone. Abruptly, Rand wondered how long she had been standing there. The lads were just... Tom began, but Moraine spoke right over the top of him. A few days respite, and you are ready to give up. Her calm, level voice contrasted sharply with her eyes. A day or two of quiet, and already you have forgotten winter nights. We haven't forgotten, Perrin said. It's just... Still not raising her voice, the Aes Sedai treated him as she had the Gleeman. Is that the way you all feel? You're all eager to run off to Ilion and forget about Trollocs and Halfmen and Drakkar. She ran her eyes over them. That stony glint playing against the everyday tone of voice made Rand uneasy. But she gave no one a chance to speak. The Dark One is after you, Tree. One or all. And if I let you go running off wherever you want to go, he will take you. Whatever the Dark One wants, I oppose. So hear this, and know it true. Before I let the Dark One have you, I will destroy you myself. It was her voice, so matter-of-fact, that convinced Rand. The Aes Sedai would do exactly what she said, if she thought it was necessary. He had a hard time sleeping that night, and he was not the only one. Even the Gleeman did not begin snoring till long after the last coals died. For once, Moraine offered no help. Those nightly talks between Egwene and the Aes Sedai were a sore point for Rand. Whenever they disappeared into the darkness, aside from the rest for privacy, he wondered what they were saying, what they were doing. What was the Aes Sedai doing to Egwene? One night, he waited until the other men had all settled down, Tom snoring like a saw cutting an oak knot. Then he slipped away, clutching his blanket around him. Using every bit of skill he had gained stalking rabbits, he moved with the moon shadows until he was crouched at the base of a tall leather-leaf tree, thick with tough, broad leaves, broken to hear Moraine and Egwene, for they had sat on a fallen log with a small lantern for light. Ask, Moraine was saying, and if I can tell you now, I will. Understand there is much for which you are not yet ready. Things you cannot learn until you have learned other things, which require still others to be learned before then. But ask what you will. The 5 powers, Egwene said slowly. Earth, wind, fire, water, and spirit. It doesn't seem fair that men should have been strongest in wielding earth and fire. Why should they have the strongest powers? Moraine laughed. Is that what you think, child? Is there a rock so hard that wind and water cannot wear it away? Fire so strong that water cannot quench it, or wind snuff it out? Egwene was silent for a time, digging her toe into the forest floor. They were the ones who tried to free the Dark One and the Forsaken, weren't they? The male Aes Sedai. She took a deep breath and picked up speed. The women were not part of it. It was the men who went mad and broke the world. You are afraid, Moraine said grimly. If you had remained in Emond's Field, you would have become wisdom in time. That was Nynaeve's plan, was it not? Or you would have sat in a women's circle and managed the affairs of Emond's Field while the village council thought it was doing so. But you did the unthinkable. You left Emond's Field, left the 2 rivers seeking adventure. You wanted to do it, and at the same time you are afraid of it. And you are stubbornly refusing to let your fear best you. You would not have asked me how a woman becomes an Aes Sedai otherwise. You would not have thrown custom and convention over the fence otherwise. No, Egwene protested. I'm not afraid. I do want to become an Aes Sedai. Better for you if you were afraid. But I hope you'll hold to that conviction. Few women these days have the ability to become an Aes Sedai, much less have the wish to. Moraine's voice sounded as if she were into herself. Surely never before 2 in one village. The old blood is indeed still strong in the 2 rivers. In the shadows, Rand shifted. A twig snapped under his foot. He froze instantly, sweating and holding his breath, but neither of the women looked around. Who? Egwene exclaimed. Who else? Is it Kari? Kari Sane? Laura Ayelin? Moraine gave an exaggerated click of her tongue, then said sternly, "You must forget I said that. Your road lies another way, I fear. Consider yourself in your own circumstances. It is not an easy road you have chosen." "I will not turn back," Egwene said. "Be that as it may. But you still want reassurance, and I cannot give it to you. Not in the way you want." "I don't understand." "You want to know that Aes Sedai are good and pure, that it was those wicked men of the legends who caused the breaking of the world, not the women. Well, it was the men, but they were no more wicked than any man. They were insane, not evil. The Aes Sedai you will find in Tar Valon are human, no different from any other women except for the ability that sets us apart. They are brave and cowardly, strong and weak, kind and cruel, warm-hearted and cold. Becoming an Aes Sedai will not change you from what you are." Egwene drew a heavy breath. "I suppose I was afraid of that I'd be changed by the power. That and the power. And, Moraine Sedai, in the name of light, why did the Trollocs come to Emond's Field?" The Aes Sedai's head swung, and she looked straight at Rand's hiding place. His breath seized in his throat. Her eyes were as hard as when she had threatened them, and he had the feeling they could penetrate the leatherleaf's thick branches. Light, what will she do if she finds me listening? He tried to melt back into the deeper shadows. With his eyes on the women, a root snagged his foot, and he barely caught himself from tumbling into dead brush that would have pointed him out with a crackle of snapping branches like fireworks. Panting, he scrambled away on all fours, keeping silent as much by luck as by anything he did. His heart pounded so hard he thought that might give him away itself. "Please drop in the Aes Sedai." After the others were sleeping, he managed to slip in among them silently. Lan moved as he dropped to the ground and jerked his blanket up, but the warder settled back with a sigh. He had only been rolling over in his sleep. Rand let out a long, silent breath. A moment later, Moraine appeared out of the night, stopping where she could study the slumbering shapes. Moonlight made a nimbus around her. Rand closed his eyes and breathed evenly, all the while listening hard for footsteps coming closer. None did. When he opened his eyes again, she was gone. When finally sleep came, it was fitful and filled with sweaty dreams where all the men in Emond's Field claimed to be the Dragon Reborn, and all the women had blue stones in their hair like the one Moraine wore. He did not try to overhear Moraine and Egwene again. On into the 6th day, the slow journey stretched. The warmthless sun slid slowly toward the treetops, while a handful of thin clouds drifted high to the north. The wind gusted higher for a moment, and Rand pulled his cloak back up onto his shoulders, muttering to himself. He wondered if they would ever get to Baerlon. The distance they had traveled from the river already was more than enough to take him from Tarn Ferry to the White River. But Lan always said it was just a short journey, whenever he was asked. Hardly worth calling a journey at all. It made him feel lost. Lan appeared ahead of them in the woods, returning from one of his forays. He reined in and rode beside Moraine, his head bent close to hers. Rand grimaced, but he did not ask any questions. Lan simply refused to acknowledge all such questions aimed at him. Only Egwene among the others even appeared to notice Lan's return, so used to this arrangement had they become, and she kept back too. The Aes Sedai might have been acting as if Egwene were in charge of the Emond's Field, but that gave her no say when the warder made his reports. Theron was carrying Mat's bow, wrapped in a thoughtful silence that seemed to take them all more and more as they got further from the two rivers. The horse's slow walk allowed Mat to practice juggling 3 stones under Tom Merlin's watchful eye. The Gleeman had given lessons each night too, as well as Lan. Lan finished whatever he had been telling Moraine, and she twisted in her saddle to look back at the others. Rand tried not to stiffen when her eyes moved across him. Did they linger on him a moment longer than on anyone else? He had the queasy feeling that she knew who had been listening in the darkness that night. "Hey, Rand," Mat called. "I can juggle 4." Rand waved in reply without looking around. "I told you I'd get to 4 before you. They had topped a low hill, and below them, a scant mile away, through the stark trees and the stretching shadows of evening, lay Baerlon. Rand gasped, trying to smile and gape at the same time. A log wall, nearly 20 feet tall, surrounded the town, with wooden watchtowers scattered along its length. Within, rooftops of slate and tile glinted with the sinking sun, and feathers of smoke drifted upward from chimneys. Hundreds of chimneys. There was not a thatched roof to be seen. A broad road ran east from the town, and another west, each with at least a dozen wagons and twice as many ox carts trudging toward the palisade. Farms lay scattered about the town, thickest to the north, while only a few broke the forest to the south. But they might as well not have existed as far as Rand was concerned. It's bigger than Emmons Field and Watson and Devon Ride all put together. And maybe Tarn Ferry, too. So that's a city, Matt breathed, leaning forward across his horse's neck to stare. Perrin could only shake his head. How can so many people live in one place? Egwene simply stared. Tom Maryland glanced at Matt, then rolled his eyes and blew out his mustaches. City, he snorted. And you, Rand? Moraine said. What do you think of your first sight of Bear Lawn? I think it's a long way from home, he said slowly, bringing a sharp laugh from Matt. You have further to go yet, Moraine said. Much further. But there is no other choice except to run and hide and run again for the rest of your lives. And short lives they would be. You must remember that when the journey becomes hard. You have no choice. Rand exchanged glances with Matt and Perrin. By their faces, they were thinking the same thing he was. How could she talk as if they had any choice after what she had said? The Aes Sedai made our choices. Moraine went on as if their thoughts were not plain. The danger begins again here. Watch what you say within those walls. Above all, do not mention Trollocs or half-men or any such. You must not even think of the Dark One. Some in Bear Lawn have even less love for Aes Sedai than do the people of Emmons Field. And there may even be dark friends. Egwene gasped, and Perrin muttered under his breath. Matt's face paled, but Moraine went on calmly. We must attract as little attention as possible. Lan was exchanging his cloak of shifting grays and greens for one of dark brown, more ordinary, though of fine cut and weave. His color-changing cloak made a large bulge in one of his saddlebags. We do not go by our own names here, Moraine continued. Here, I am known as Alice, and Lan is Andra. Remember that. Good. Let us be within the walls before night catches us. The gates of Bear Lawn are closed from sundown to sunrise. Lan led the way down the hill and through the woods toward the log wall. The road passed half a dozen farms, none lay close, and none of the people finishing their chores seemed to notice the travelers. Ending at heavy wooden gates bound with wide straps of black iron. They were closed tight, even if the sun was not down yet. Lan rode close to the wall and gave a tug to a frayed rope hanging down beside the gates. A bell clanged on the other side of the wall. Abruptly, a wizened face under a battered cloth cap peered down suspiciously from atop the wall, glaring between the cut-off ends of two of the logs, a good 3 spans over their heads. "What's all this, eh? It's too late in the day to be opening this gate. Too late, I say. Go around to the White Bridge Gate if you want to." Moraine's mare moved out to where the man atop the wall had a clear view of her. Suddenly his wrinkles deepened in a gap-toothed smile, and he seemed to quiver between speaking and doing his duty. "I didn't know it was you, mistress. Wait, I'll be right down. Just wait. I'm coming. The head dipped out of sight, but Rand could still hear muffled shouts for them to stay where they were, that he was coming. With great creaks of disuse, the right-hand gate slowly swung outward. It stopped when opened just wide enough for one horse to pass through at a time, and the gatekeeper poked his head into the gap, flashed his half-toothless smile at them again, and darted back out of the way. Moraine followed Lan through, with Egwene right behind her. Rand trotted Cloud after Bella and found himself in a narrow street fronted by high wooden fences and warehouses, tall and windowless. Broad doors closed up tight. Moraine and Lan were already on foot speaking to the wrinkle-faced gatekeeper, so Rand dismounted too. The little man, in a much-mended cloak and coat, held his cloth cap crumpled in one hand and ducked his head whenever he spoke. He peered at those dismounting behind Lan and Moraine and shook his head. "Down-country folk," he grinned. "Why, Mistress Alice, you taking up collecting down-country folk with hay in their hair?" His look took in Tom Maryland then. "You ain't a sheep farmer. I remember letting you go through some days back, I do. Didn't like your tricks down country, eh, Gleeman?" I hope you remember to forget letting us through, Master Oven, Lan said, pressing a coin into the man's free hand. And letting us back in, too. No need for that, Master Endra. No need for that. You give me plenty when you went out. Plenty! Just the same, Oven made the coin disappear as deftly as if he were a gleeman, too. I ain't told nobody, and I won't either. Especially not them white cloaks, he finished with a scowl. He pursed up his lips to spit, then glanced at Moraine and swallowed instead. Rand blinked, but kept his mouth shut. The others did, too, though it appeared to be an effort in that. Children of the light, Rand thought wonderingly. Stories told about the children by peddlers and merchants' guards varied from admiration to hatred. But all agreed the children hated Aes Sedai as much as they did dark friends. He wondered if this was more trouble already. The children are in Baerlon, Lan demanded. They surely are. The gatekeeper bobbed his head. Came the same day you left, as I recall. Ain't nobody here likes them at all. Most don't let on, of course. Have they said why they are here? Moraine asked intently. Why they're here, mistress? Oven was so astonished he forgot to duck his head. Of course they said why. Oh, I forgot. You've been down country. Likely you ain't heard nothing but sheep bleating. They say they're here because of what's going on down in Gila-Dan. The dragon, you know. Well, him as calls himself dragon. They say the fellow's stirring up evil, which I expect he is. And they're here to stamp it out. Only he's down there in Gila-Dan, not here. Just an excuse to meddle in other people's business is what I figure. There's already been the dragon's fang on some people's doors. This time he did speak. Have they caused much trouble then? Lan said, and Oven shook his head vigorously. Not that they don't want to, I expect. Only the governor don't trust them no more than I do. He won't let but maybe 10 or so inside the walls at one time. And ain't they mad about that? The rest of it camp a little ways north, I hear. Bet they got the farmers looking over their shoulders. The ones that do come in, they just stalk around in those white cloaks, looking down their noses at honest folk. Walking the light, they say, and it's an order. Near come to blows more than once with the wagoneers and miners and smelters and all, and even the watch. But the governor wants it all peaceful, and that's how it's been so far. If they're hunting evil, I say, why aren't they up in Saldaea? There's some kind of trouble up there, I hear. Or down in Gila-Dan. There's been a big battle down there, they say. Real big. Moraine drew a soft breath. I had heard that Aes Sedai was going to Gila-Dan. Yes, they did, mistress. Oven's head started bobbing again. They went to Gila-Dan, all right. And that's what started this battle, or so I hear. They say some of those Aes Sedai are dead. Maybe all of them. I know some folks don't hold with Aes Sedai, but I say, who else is going to stop a false dragon, huh? And those damn fools who think they can be men Aes Sedai or some such, what about them? Of course, some say, not the white cloaks, mind, and not me, but some folks, that maybe this fellow really is the dragon reborn. He can do things, I hear. Use the one power. There's thousands following him. Don't be a fool, Lan snapped, and Oven's face folded into a hurt look. I'm only saying what I heard, ain't I? Just what I heard, Master Endra. They say, some do, that he's moving his army east and south toward Tyr. His voice became heavy with meaning. They say he's named them the people of the dragon. Names mean little, Moraine said calmly. If anything she had heard disturbed her, she gave no outward sign of it now. You could call your mule people of the dragon if you wanted. Not likely, mistress, Oven chuckled. Not with the white cloaks around for sure. I don't expect anybody else would look kindly on a name like that neither. I see what you mean, but... Oh, no, mistress. Not my mule. No doubt a wise decision, Moraine said. Now we must be off. And don't you worry, mistress, Oven said, with a deep bob of his head. I ain't seen nobody. He darted to the gate and began tugging it closed with quick jerks. Ain't seen nobody, and ain't seen nothing. The gate thudded shut, and he pulled down the locking bar with a rope. In fact, mistress, this gate ain't been open in days. The light illumine you, Oven, Moraine said. She led them away from the gate then, Rand looked back once, and Avin was still standing in front of the gate. He seemed to be polishing a coin with an edge of his cloak and chuckling. The way led through dirt streets, barely the width of 2 wagons, empty of people, all lined with warehouses and occasional high wooden fences. Rand walked a time beside the Gleeman. Tom, what was all that about Tyr and the people of the Dragon? Tyr is a thing all the way down on the Sea of Storms, isn't it? The Carathan cycle, Tom said curtly. Rand blinked. The prophecies of the Dragon? Nobody tells those stories in the 2 rivers. Not in Emond's Field, anyway. The wisdom would skin them alive if they did.
I suppose she would at that,
Tom said dryly. He glanced at Moraine up ahead with Lan, saw she could not overhear, and went on.
Tyr is the greatest port on the Sea of Storms, and the Stone of Tyr is the fortress that guards it. The stone is said to be the first fortress built after the breaking of the world, and in all this time it has never fallen, though more than one army has tried. One of the prophecies says that the Stone of Tyr will never fall until the people of the Dragon come to the stone. Another says the stone will never fall till the sword that cannot be touched is wielded by the dragon's hand. Tom grimaced. The fall of the stone will be one of the major proofs that the dragon has been reborn. May the stone stand till I am dust.
The sword that cannot be touched?
That's what it says. I don't know whether it is a sword. Whatever it is, it lies in the heart of the stone, the central citadel of the fortress. None but the High Lords of Tyr can enter there. They never speak of what lies inside. Certainly not the Gleeman, anyway.
Rand frowned. The stone cannot fall until the dragon wields the sword. But how can he unless the stone has already fallen? Is the dragon supposed to be a High Lord of Tyr?
Not much chance of that, the Gleeman said dryly. Tyr hates anything to do with the power, even more than Amador. And Amador is the stronghold of the Children of the Light.
Then how can the prophecy be fulfilled? Rand asked. I'd like it well enough if the dragon was never reborn, but a prophecy that cannot be fulfilled doesn't make much sense. It sounds like a story meant to make people think the dragon never will be reborn. Is that it?
You ask an awful lot of questions, boy, Tom said. A prophecy that was easily fulfilled would not be worth much, now would it? Suddenly his voice brightened. Well, we're here, wherever here is.
Lan had stopped by a section of high wooden fence that looked no different from any other they had passed. He was working the blade of his dagger between 2 of the boards. Abruptly, he gave a grunt of satisfaction, pulled, and a length of fence swung out like a gate. In fact, it was a gate, Rand saw, though one meant to be opened only from the other side. The metal latch that Lan had lifted with his dagger showed that. Moraine went through immediately, drawing Aldeed behind her. Lan motioned the others to follow and brought up the rear, closing the gate behind him. On the other side of the fence, Rand found himself in the stable yard of an inn. A loud bustle and clatter came from the building's kitchen, but what struck him was its size. It covered more than twice as much ground as the Wine Spring Inn, and was 4 stories high besides. Well over half the windows were aglow in the deepening twilight. He wondered at this city that could have so many strangers in it. No sooner had they come well into the stable yard than 3 men in dirty canvas aprons appeared at the huge stable's broad arched doors. One, a wiry fellow, and the only one without a manure fork in his hand, came forward waving his arms. "Here, here! You can't come in that way. You'll have to go around the front." Lan's hand went to his purse again, but even as it did, another man, as big around as Master Alvear, came hurrying out of the inn. Puffs of hair stuck out above his ears, and his sparkling white apron was as good as a sign proclaiming him the innkeeper. "It's all right, Mutt," the newcomer said. "It's all right. These folk are expected guests. Take care of their horses now. Good care." Mutt sullenly knuckled his forehead, then motioned his 2 companions to come help. Rand and the others hurriedly got their saddlebags and blanket rolls down, while the innkeeper turned to Moraine. He gave her a deep bow and spoke with a genuine smile. "Welcome, Mistress Alice. Welcome. It's good to be seeing you. You and Master Andra both. Very good. Your fine conversation has been missed. Yes, it has. I must say I worried you going down country and all. Well, I mean at a time like this, with the weather all crazy and wolves howling right up to the walls in the night." Abruptly, he slapped both hands against his round belly and shook his head.
Here I go on like this, chattering away instead of taking you inside. Come, come. Hot meals and warm beds, that's what you'll be wanting. And the best in Baerlon are right here. The very best.
And hot baths, too, I trust, Master Fitch, Moraine said, and Egwene echoed her fervently. Oh, yes.
Baths? The innkeeper said. Why, just the best and the hottest in Baerlon. Come, welcome to the Stag and Lion. Welcome to Baerlon.
Chapter 14. The Stag and Lion. Inside, the inn was every bit as busy as the sounds coming from it had indicated and more. The party from Emmons Field followed Master Fitch through the back door, soon weaving around and between a constant stream of men and women in long aprons, platters of food and trays of drink held high. The bearers murmured quick apologies when they got in anyone's way, but they never slowed by a step. One of the men took hurried orders from Master Fitch and disappeared at a run.
The inn is near full, I'm afraid,
the innkeeper told Moraine.
Almost to the rafters. Every inn in the town is the same. With the winter we just had, well, as soon as it cleared enough for them to get down out of the mountains, we were inundated. Yes, that's the word. Inundated by men from the mines and smelters. All telling the most horrible tales. Wolves, and worse. The kind of tales men tell when they've been cooped up all winter. I can't think there's anyone left up there at all. We have that many here. But never fear. Things may be a little crowded, but I'll do my best by you and Master Andra. And your friends, too, of course.
He glanced curiously once or twice at Rand and the others. Except for Tom, their clothes named them country folk, and Tom's gleeman's cloak made him a strange traveling companion as well for Mistress Alice and Master Andra.
I will do my best, you may rest assured.
Rand stared at the bustle around them and tried to avoid being stepped on, though none of the help really seemed to be in any danger of that. He kept thinking of how Master Alvir and his wife tended the Winespring Inn with sometimes a little assistance from their daughters. Mat and Perrin craned their necks in interest toward the common room, from which rolled a wave of laughter and singing and jovial shouting whenever the wide door at the end of the hall swung open. Muttering about finding out the news, the warder grimly disappeared through that swinging door, swallowed by a wave of merriment. Rand wanted to follow him, but he wanted a bath even more. He could have done with people and laughing right then, but the common room would appreciate his presence more when he was clean. Mat and Perrin apparently felt the same. Mat was scratching surreptitiously. Master Fitch, Moraine said, I understand there are children of the light in Baerlon. Is there likely to be trouble?
Oh, never you worry about them, Mistress Alice. They're up to their usual tricks. Claim there's an Aes Sedai in the town.
Moraine lifted an eyebrow, and the innkeeper spread his plump hands.
Don't you worry. They've tried it before. There's no Aes Sedai in Baerlon, and the governor knows it. The White Cloaks think if they show an Aes Sedai, some woman they claim is an Aes Sedai, people will let all of them inside the walls. Well, I suppose some would. But most people know what the White Cloaks are up to, and they support the governor. No one wants to see some harmless old woman hurt just so the children can have an excuse for whipping up a frenzy.
I am glad to hear it, Moraine said dryly. She put a hand on the innkeeper's arm. Is Min still here? I wish to talk with her, if she is. Master Fitch's answer was lost to Rand in the arrival of attendants to lead them to the baths. Moraine and Egwene vanished behind a plump woman with a ready smile and an armload of towels. The Gleeman and Rand and his friends found themselves following a slight dark-haired fellow, Ara by name. Rand tried asking Ara about Baerlon, but the man barely said 2 words together except to say Rand had a funny accent. And then the first sight of the bath chamber drove all thoughts of talk right out of Rand's head. A dozen tall copper bathtubs sat in a circle on the tiled floor, which sloped down slightly to a drain in the center of the big stone-walled room. A thick towel, neatly folded, and a large cake of yellow soap sat on a stool beside each tub, and big black iron cauldrons of water stood heating over fires along one wall. On the opposite wall, logs blazing and a deep fireplace added to the general warmth. Almost as good as the Winespring Inn back home, Perrin said loyally, if not exactly with great attention to truth. Tom barked a laugh, and Mat sniggered. Sounds like we brought a Copland with us and didn't know it. Rand shrugged out of his cloak and stripped off his clothes, while Ara filled 4 of the copper tubs.
None of the others was far behind Rand in choosing a bathtub. Once their clothes were all in piles on the stools, Ara brought them each a large bucket of hot water and a dipper. That done, he sat on a stool by the door, leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed, apparently lost in his own thoughts. There was little in the way of conversation while they lathered and sluiced away a week of grime with dippers of steaming water. Then it was into the tubs for a long soak. Ara had made the water hot enough that settling in was a slow process of luxuriant sighs. The air in the room went from warm to misty and hot. For a long time, there was no sound except the occasional long, relaxing exhalation as tight muscles loosened and a chill that they had come to think permanent was drawn out of their bones. "Need anything else?" Ara asked suddenly. He did not have much room to talk about people's accents. He and Master Fitch both sounded as if they had a mouthful of mush. "More towels? More hot water?" "Nothing," said Tom in his reverberant voice. Eyes closed, he gave an indolent wave of his hand. "Go and enjoy the evening. At a later time I will see that you receive more than adequate recompense for your services." He settled lower in the tub until the water covered everything but his eyes and nose. Ara's eyes went to the stools behind the tubs, where their clothes and belongings were stacked. He glanced at the bow, but lingered longest over Rand's sword and Perrin's axe. "Is there trouble down country, too?" he said abruptly. "In the rivers, or whatever you call it." "The two rivers," Matt said, pronouncing each separate word distinctly. "It's the two rivers. As for trouble, why—" "What do you mean, two?" Rand asked. "Is there some kind of trouble here?" Perrin, enjoying his soak, murmured, "Good, good." Tom raised himself back up a little and opened his eyes. "Here," Ara snorted. "Trouble? Miners having fistfights in the streets in the dark of the morning aren't trouble. Or—" He stopped and eyed them a moment. "I meant the Gila Dawn kind of trouble," he said finally. "No, I suppose not. Nothing but sheep down country, is there? No offense. I just meant it's quiet down there. Still, it's been a strange winter. Strange things in the mountains. I heard the other day there were Trollocs up in Saldaia. But that's the borderlands then, isn't it?" He finished with his mouth still open. Then he snapped it shut, appearing surprised that he had said so much. Rand had tensed at the word Trollocs and tried to hide it by wringing his washcloth out over his head. As the fellow went on, he relaxed. But not everyone kept his mouth shut. "Trollocs," Matt chortled. Rand splashed water at him, but Matt just wiped it off of his face with a grin. "You just let me tell you about Trollocs." For the first time since climbing into his tub, Tom spoke. "Why don't you not? I'm a little tired of hearing my own stories back from you." "He's a gleeman," Perrin said, and Ara gave him a scornful look. "I saw the cloak. You going to perform?" "Just a minute," Matt protested. "What's this about me telling Tom stories? Are you all—" "You just don't tell them as well as Tom," Rand cut him off hastily, and Perrin hopped in. "You keep adding in things, trying to make it better, and they never do. And you get it all mixed up, too," Rand added. "Best leave it to Tom." They were all talking so fast that Ara stared at them with his mouth hanging open. Matt stared, too, as if everyone else had suddenly gone crazy. Rand wondered how to shut him up, short of jumping on him. The door banged open to admit Lan, brown cloak slung over one shoulder, along with a gust of cooler air that momentarily thinned the mist. "Well," the warder said, rubbing his hands, "this is what I have been waiting for." Ara picked up a bucket, but Lan waved it away. "No, I will see to myself." Dropping his cloak on one of the stools, he bundled the bath attendant out of the room, despite the fellow's protests, and shut the door firmly after him. He waited there a moment, his head cocked to listen, and when he turned back to the rest of them, his voice was stony and his eyes stabbed at Matt. "It's a good thing I got back when I did, farm boy. Don't you listen to what you are told?" "I didn't do anything," Matt protested. "I was just going to tell him about the Trollocs, not about—" He stopped and leaned back from the warder's eyes, flat against the back of the tub. "Don't talk about Trollocs," Lan said grimly. "Don't even think about Trollocs." With an angry snort, he began filling himself a bathtub. "Blood and ashes. You had better remember the Dark One has eyes and ears where you least expect. And if the Children of the Light heard Trollocs were after you, they'd be burning to get their hands on you. To them, it would be as much as naming you Dark Friend. It may not be what you are used to, But until we get where we are going, keep your trust small, unless Mistress Alice or I tell you differently." At his emphasis on the name Moraine was using, Matt flinched. "There was something that fellow wouldn't tell us," Rand said. "Something he thought was trouble, but he wouldn't say what it was."
"Probably the children," Lan said, pouring more hot water into his tub. "Most people consider them trouble. Some don't, though. And he did not know you well enough to risk it. You might have gone running to the White Cloaks for all he knew."
Rand shook his head. This place already sounded worse than Tarn Ferry could possibly be. "He said there were Trollocs in Soldaia, wasn't it?" Perrin said.
Lan hurled his empty bucket to the floor with a crash. "You will talk about it, won't you? There are always Trollocs in the borderlands, Blacksmith. Just you put it in the front of your mind that we want no more attention than mice in a field. Concentrate on that. Moraine wants to get you all to Tar Valon alive, and I will do it if it can be done. But if you bring any harm to her..."
The rest of their bathing was done in silence, and dressing afterwards, too. When they left the bath chamber, Moraine was standing at the end of the hall with a slender girl not much taller than herself. At least Rand thought it was a girl, though her dark hair was cut short and she wore a man's shirt and trousers. Moraine said something, and the girl looked at the men sharply, then nodded to Moraine and hurried away. "Well now," Moraine said as they drew closer, "I am sure a bath has given you all an appetite. Master Fitch has given us a private dining room." She talked on inconsequentially as she turned to lead the way, about their rooms and the crowding in the town, and how the innkeeper hoped Tom would favor the common room with some music and a story or two. She never mentioned the girl, if girl it had been. The private dining room had a polished oak table with a dozen chairs around it, and a thick rug on the floor. As they entered, Egwene, freshly gleaming hair combed out around her shoulders, turned from warming her hands at the fire crackling on the hearth. Rand had had plenty of time for thought during the long silence in the bath chamber. Lan's constant admonitions not to trust anyone, and especially Ara being afraid to trust them, had made him think of just how alone they really were. It seemed they could not trust anyone but themselves, and he was still not too sure how far they could trust Moraine or Lan. Just themselves. And Egwene was still Egwene. Moraine said it would have happened to her anyway, this touching the true source.